Every few blocks of sets, the Pokemon trading card game introduces new cards with unique mechanics or special effects to change the format from what it was previously. While there have been many powerful mechanics stemming from this, such as various forms of strong Pokemon worth multiple prize cards while KO'd, like Pokemon EX, GX, or V, many other worse mechanics have fallen completely to the wayside. At the very worst of all of these failed mechanics were the Crystal Pokemon. There were two waves of Crystal Pokemon, the first released in the Aqua Polis expansion and the second in the Expedition expansion. These Pokemon's designs were so fundamentally flawed and terrible that not a single one of them ever saw the slightest niche and serious competitive play. Even in the unofficial e-card format, a format consisting of only 3 sets, and one of the lowest powered Pokemon formats in the history of the TCG. These cards are now looked down on as some of the worst individual cards of all time. For cards that were supposed to make the game more exciting, they couldn't have been any less impactful. To really understand just why these cards were never taken seriously, let's look at Lugia. All Crystal Pokemon share the same Crystal-type Pokebody. This Pokebody changed the type of the Crystal Pokemon to whichever of the 3 listed basic energies that you attach to it from your hand that turn. The other mechanically defining aspect of Crystal Pokemon was their 2 attacks with wildly different attack costs. The first attack of each Crystal Pokemon always cost 2 different types of basic energy, while the second attack would have energy requirements that were not present in the first attack. With the Lugia example, we see the first attack costs 1 Psychic and 1 Fire energy, while the second attack costs 2 Water energy and 1 Psychic energy, and 1 Colorless energy. This already presents a massive hurdle for any Crystal Pokemon to overcome in order to be viable. Because of Crystal Pokemon's attacks consisting of a total of 3 different energy types, they were inherently less consistent than regular Pokemon. A majority of competitively viable Pokemon decks rarely go above running 2 different types of energy, due to the possibility of not drawing the energy you need in order to use the attacks you want. In a deck with more than 1 type of basic energy, you run the risk of being able to fall behind drawing the wrong energy types. While there are cards to help relieve this issue, such as Rainbow Energy, it does come at the cost of putting 1 damage count to the Pokemon you attach it to, as well as being a special energy. The later distinction matters heavily when it comes to playing Rainbow Energy in decks with Crystal Pokemon, since the Crystal-type Pokebody only activates when you attach a basic energy to it. Even if you tried to work around the highly restrictive energy cost of Crystal Pokemon, doing so meant that you couldn't take advantage of their ability to change types in order to hit different weaknesses on opponents' Pokemon. While the intended design of letting your Crystal Pokemon change types is pretty obvious, it almost never worked out how you wanted it to in practice. Since you could only change the Crystal Pokemon's type to the type basic energy attached to it, you often were limited by which attack you were trying to power up. Using the example of Lugia, let's say you have 1 Psychic and 1 Fire energy attached to it. If, on your 3rd turn, you might have to make a choice between attaching a Water energy in order to work up towards its Steam Blast attack, or attaching a Psychic or Fire energy to change Lugia's type to either of these to hit a weakness you could last turn. If you did the former, you wouldn't be able to take advantage of the type changing ability, meaning you're just playing a less powerful version of any other attacker. If you do the latter to take advantage of a Crystal type in order to attack the defending Pokemon's weakness, you were almost wasting your single energy attachment for the turn since it wasn't working you towards a better attack. This restrictive design also had the downside that if you wanted to continue taking advantage of Crystal type, you couldn't power up other alternative attackers since your attachment had to go to your Crystal Pokemon. One of the really sad parts about Crystal Pokemon is that Lugia, a terrible card by every metric, is actually one of the best Crystal Pokemon. To show how bad some of these cards were, take Crystal Nidoking as an example. While its first attack is weak for Stage 2 Pokemon and the energy needed to use it, the attack cost is in line with the normal Pokemon's only requiring a single type of basic energy. The real issue with this card is that the second attack cost requires 2 different basic energy types, which don't appear in the first attack at all. For obvious reasons, this is incredibly detrimental to any potential competitive viability. If you wanted to use Nidoking's first attack, it functionally set you back 2 turns since those first 2 basic grass energy attachments didn't work towards your second attack at all. Sadly, it's also not the only Crystal Pokemon to have this same fundamentally flawed design. Crystal Crobat had a similar issue with the requirement for its second attack being completely incompatible with its first attack, because Crobat's squared attack had no requirement for fire energy like its poison flame attack. It functionally meant that trying to use the second attack after the first would cost 4 energy total instead of 3. In Nidoking's case, Rolling Thunder practically costs 2 electric energy, 2 fighting energy, and 2 grass energy unless you attach rainbow energy to it in order to circumvent this horrible anti-synergy. Even though rainbow energy doesn't work with crystal type as previously mentioned, it was pretty much the only way to even remotely enable these Pokemon. However, had the Crystal Pokemon's attacks been powerful, there might have been a good reason to try and jump through the various hoops needed to enable them. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case. and most Crystal Pokemon actually had weaker attacks than their counterparts. To illustrate this, we can compare Crobat to Charizard, a powerful Stage 2 attacker. As previously mentioned, Crobat's squared attack functionally costs 4 energy, 1 grass, 1 fire, and 2 psychic, and it has the effect to deal 20 damage for each of 4 coin flips that come up heads. This meant that for 4 energy of 3 different basic types, you could deal 80 damage with a Stage 2 Pokemon, only 6.25% of the time you use this attack. Compare that to Charizard's Scorching Whirlwind attack, which has a significantly easier cost to use, only needing 4 fire energy, and will always deal 120 damage, enough to KO most Pokemon at the time. Although it does have the downside of potentially discarding all energies attached to it, there were a fair few ways to build your decks that you could continuously power up Charizards. It's pretty obvious that the designers of the game intentionally weakened the power of Crystal Pokemon's attacks compared to other Stage 2 Pokemon, most likely for the reason that they could change types to hit for different weaknesses. Unfortunately, being completely outclassed in every regard by pretty much every other Pokemon that existed in the game at the time, meant that nobody even bothered to use them. Ironically enough, attacks like Crobats that required coin flips to go well in order to do damage were present on 2 other Stage 2 Crystal Pokemon, those being Crystal Kabutops and Charizard. They also had the exact same design flaws as Crobat. Both of their second attacks functionally cost an extra colorless energy if you weren't using Rainbow Energy, and capped out an amount of damage less than the other Stage 2 Pokemon at the time. Crystal Kingdra also had the issues of horrendous energy costs for its attacks, but didn't even have a potentially high damage cap, with its dual burn attack only dealing 60 damage, and even having a downside of needing to discard an energy for each of the 2 coin flips that came up as tails. Funnily enough, Kingdra actually could have potentially seen a competitive niche if its attack was good, since decks built around a different Kingdra and its water cyclone Pokepower that lets you remove water energy from your active Pokemon to any of your other Pokemon is actually one of the better strategies you can play in the unofficial e-card only format. These decks even already play cards like Rainbow Energy to facilitate attackers of different types. Crystal Kingdra, being a Pokemon that fit into an evolution line the deck was already playing, could have given it some kind of niche if its attack was just better than it is. The card is actually so bad that it's outclassed as an alternative attacker for Kingdra decks by Moltres and Zapdos, 2 Pokemon with a downside Pokebody that prevents you from attaching energy cards of their own type to them, including Rainbow Energy, due to that card counting as all types of basic energies while it's in your hand. While these 2 Pokemon were hard to enable, needing you to use Water Cyclone to move Rainbow Energy to them in order to use their attacks, these hoops were worth jumping through, since dealing 60 damage with a basic attacker for 4 energy with minimal downsides gave Kingdra decks good flexibility in their game plan, something that Crystal Pokemon were supposed to provide. Being outclassed by 2 Pokemon that actively had downsides built into them does a lot in showing just how impractical building around Crystal Pokemon really is. However, that's not to say you couldn't play a deck focused on Crystal Pokemon if you really wanted to. While the official format at the time Crystal Pokemon were around was far too powerful for them, the e-reader card format does have a significantly lower power level, as well as having some support Pokemon that do potentially enable a strategy built around Crystal Pokemon. There were 2 Pokemon that had this bad mechanic that actually had some interesting uses that justify trying to build around them. Both the previously mentioned Crystal Lugia and its counterpart Crystal Ho-Oh are basic Pokemon with somewhat reasonable damage output and HP. In the e-card format, there are very few basic Pokemon with good damage output, with the aforementioned legendary birds arguably being the best of them. Lugia and Ho-Oh have an equal HP stat of 80, a pretty decent amount at the time, and had only slightly lower damage output to the legendary birds, with Lugia's Steam Blast and Ho-Oh's Scalding Steam dealing 50 and 40 damage respectively. When you factor in Crystal type's effects to change typing, these 2 Pokemon can actually threaten 1 or 2 hit KOs on many of the most powerful Pokemon in the format, such as Beedrill, Alakazam, and Typhlosion. Unfortunately, both Crystal Pokemon have pretty bad weaknesses, with Lugia being weak to Psychic and Ho-Oh being weak to Water. This meant that, although they can, in theory, deal good damage to a large portion of the e-card metagame, 2 of the best decks of the previously mentioned Kingdra and Alakazam constantly threatened to one-hit KO them. Some of the supportive evolutionary lines played in the e-card format deck also fit well with these 2 Crystal Pokemon. Cards like Clefable and Moonlit Pokepower let you shuffle a card from your hand into your deck to grab any basic energy you need at the time, providing some amount of consistency for the difficult attack cost of Crystal Pokemon. When combined with another popular Pokemon in Porygon 2, you create a solid draw engine thanks to its backup Pokepower, letting you draw cards until you have 3 in hand. With Moonlit letting you exchange any card in your hand for basic energy you could then attach, you're frequently able to use backup to continue amassing cards in hand. If you really wanted to, you can combine this Moonlit and backup draw engine with Venusaur and its Harvest Bounty Pokepower that lets you attach an additional energy to your active Pokemon whenever you attach an energy to it. This combination of evolution lines gives you an easy access to continue sending up powerful attackers in spite of the restrictive attack costs. Even with all of this, however, the crystal Pokemon are generally not worth running, since decks built around Charizard actually use this exact same combination of cards while dealing more damage than Lugia and Ho-Oh can, regardless of whatever types they are. The only merit to using this 3-part engine with the 2 crystal Pokemon is that they are basic Pokemon, meaning you do get a slight boost in consistency compared to relying on a Stage 2 Pokemon for damage. Although in a format as slow as E-Card only, this isn't really a major downside worth avoiding. Ultimately, although it is possible to build a deck around crystal Pokemon, they are still generally outclassed by other options. This is more of a flaw with a lower power level crystal Pokemon than their difficult attack costs, since you could evidently build your deck to compensate for that downside. Historically, there have been Pokemon cards with attacks that required multiple basic energy types and seen competitive success, with the difference being those attacks were made worthwhile for their difficult to enable energy costs. The most immediately available comparison to crystal Pokemon are the amazing rare Pokemon from Sword and Shield expansions. While they aren't technically a set mechanic and are just a special rarity, each Pokemon of this rarity has attacks that mirror the 3 basic energy attack costs of crystal Pokemon. Take a look at Raikou. Its amazing shot attack costs 1 grass, 1 electric, and 1 metal energy, and deals 120 damage to the active Pokemon, as well as to 1 bench Pokemon. The main difference that sets amazing rare Pokemon apart from crystal Pokemon, as well as what gave them their competitive niche, is that their attacks are extremely powerful in order to make up for the difficult attack costs. Amazing Shot is so strong of an attack for a 1-price basic Pokemon to have that the most comparable attack to it is Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX's G-Max Rapid Flow attack, which costs 2 fighting and 1 colorless energy to deal 120 damage to 2 Pokemon, as well as having to discard all energies attached to it. While this attack can deal damage to 2 bench Pokemon instead of the active and 1 bench Pokemon, this attack has a significant downside where Amazing Shot doesn't. Goes to show how strong it is. Raikou wasn't the only amazing rare to have seen competitive success. Amazing Rare Yveltal had an incredible attack with a very rarely seen effect. Its amazing destruction attack costs 1 fire, 1 psychic, and 1 darkness, and 2 colorless energy, and has the effect of knocking out your opponent's active Pokemon. For obvious reasons, getting to KO your opponent's active Pokemon with a single attack at no downside other than the difficult to use energy cost is extremely powerful. This attack also meant that the Yveltal could always take more prizes from KOs than your opponent could from KOing it, as long as you attacked a Pokemon worth 2 or more prize cards. Although these attacks are powerful, their difficult energy costs made them hard to enable for a majority of their time in the standard format. However, this changed with the release of the Lost Origin and Silver Tempest expansions. In Lost Origin, the item card Mirage Gate was released. This card is one of the strongest energy acceleration item cards ever printed, having the effect of letting the player attach up to 2 basic energy, each of different types, from their deck to their Pokemon in any way they like. The only requirements this card has is that you need 7 or more cards in the Lost Zone in order to use it. For those of you who don't know, the Lost Zone is a zone certain cards can put other cards into, such as their Comfy's Flower Selection ability. Decks built around using Mirage Gate could very easily set up the 7 cards needed in the Lost Zone. Lost Zone decks would often play Amazing Raikou and Amazing Rayquaza as 2 powerful basic attackers. Mirage Gate enabled extremely fast Amazing Shots from Raikou to put a lot of pressure on your opponent during the early stages of the game while they were still trying to set up. Later in the game, they could use Rayquaza's Amazing Burst attack to deal 80 damage for each type of basic energy you discard from it. Lost Zone decks could easily attach up to 4 different types of basic energy to deal 400 damage with a single attack. For comparison, Crystal Charizard's Dragon Tail attack, the strongest attack damage-wise of Crystal Pokemon can deal, has the effect of dealing 50 damage for each of 2 coins that come up heads. For reference, many powerful Pokemon in the E-Card format only had 110 HP or more. While the E-Card format didn't have much energy acceleration, the format being significantly slower than it is today meant that Crystal Pokemon could have been worth running if they had attacks of similar quality to those of the amazing rares. Unfortunately, Crystal Pokemon were not well designed. The awkward energy costs that conflicted with one another greatly weighed down their playability. While the Crystal-type Pokepower is an interesting and unique effect, it's ultimately too difficult to use in a meaningful way. It also didn't help that the attacks of Crystal Pokemon were made seemingly worse than their non-Crystal counterparts due to the possibility of being able to hit multiple different weaknesses with just one Pokemon. While the Crystal Pokemon combine a wide variety of different unique designs, those aspects don't go together to create a powerful card. Sometimes Pokemon tries new things that just don't quite pan out. And in today's episode of Failed Mechanics, we'll be looking at the Legends mechanic, a unique mechanic that split one card over multiple different parts. Legend Pokemon were introduced right besides Prime Pokemon in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. While Prime Pokemon were simply stronger Pokemon with no mechanical specific function and worked more as an additional rarity for booster packs, Legends were the most unique mechanic that Pokemon TCG had seen up to this point. Pokemon EX from the EX series were simply more powerful Pokemon that in exchange gave up 2 prize cards instead of 1, and Level X Pokemon from Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum era of the Pokemon TCG were evolved forms of their regular counterparts. Legends required a whole new mechanic in order to be put into play. Legend Pokemon featured various legendary Pokemon, and in order to be played, a player has to have the top and bottom half of that specific card in their hand. There were a total of 9 Legend Pokemon split across the Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Things started off with Lugia Legend and Ho-Oh Legend, Heart Gold and Soul Silver, followed by Entei and Raikou Legend, Raikou and Suicune Legend, and Suicune and Entei Legend, Heart Gold and Soul Silver Unleashed. And Heart Gold and Soul Silver Undaunted featured legendary Pokemon from the 3rd generation. Another interesting part about this mechanic is the number of prize cards that a Legend Pokemon gives up when getting knocked out actually depends on the number of Pokemon that are featured on the card. Unlike more recent game mechanics like Tag Team Pokemon where Pikachu and Zekrom GX and Arceus and Dialga and Pialka GX both give up 3 prize cards. While the majority of Legend Pokemon in fact feature 2 Pokemon and therefore give up 2 prize cards, the first 2 Legend Pokemon, Ho-Oh and Lugia, actually only give up 1 prize card each. Another interesting part about those cards is the weaknesses and resistance distribution. While cards normally have both parts printed on the cards, even if either of them doesn't apply to the Pokemon, Legend Pokemon with 2 Pokemon on them do not feature the resistance slot at all, but instead have 2 weaknesses, one for each of the Pokemon on it. Single Pokemon Legends have both weaknesses and resistances just like any other Pokemon. Unlike most other mechanics, there was very little direct support for Pokemon Legends. As a matter of fact, only one card that specifically supported Legend Pokemon ever got printed. Legend Box is an item card from Heart Gold and Soul Silver Undaunted, and is an item card that lets you look at the top 10 cards of your deck. Reveal 2 pieces of the same Legend Pokemon you find there, bench it, then lets you attach all energies in those 10 cards to the Pokemon. With very few cards being able to even closely manipulate the order of cards in your deck, or to put cards on top, this card was no suitable option for decks trying to get out their Legend Pokemon this way. Considering the amount of support that most other mechanics got, or keep getting to this day, makes it feel like the game designers never fully intended for Legends to be part of the game and preferred them as collectibles. So, why exactly is the mechanic bad? Now, while the mechanic was unique and refreshing at the time, it came with a variety of issues that stopped it from catching on immediately. Let's talk about the cards themselves first. Thanks to Platinum expansions, the SP mechanic featured a variety of normally evolved Pokemon as basic Pokemon, and these Pokemon were stronger than any other cards of the format at the time. The first issue with Legends was getting them into play. While most cards are either basic, stage 1, or stage 2, Legend Pokemon were actually not considered basic Pokemon, but non-evolved Pokemon instead. The main issue that arose with this was that only cards that didn't specify what kind of cards you can get were able to fetch them from your deck. This meant that cards like Dual Ball and Pokemon Collector would not search for these pieces, but there were a few that could. At the time, those cards were Bebe's Search from Diamond and Pearl Mysterious Treasure, a support card that requires you to put 1 card from your hand on top of your deck to search your deck for a Pokemon and put it into your hand. Luxury Ball, an item from Diamond and Pearl Stormfront, card that searches your deck for any Pokemon except level X, but can't be used when another copy of Luxury Ball is in your discard pile. And lastly, Pokemon Communication, an item card from Heart Gold and Soul Silver that works similarly to Bebe's Search, except instead of putting any card on top of your deck, you have to put a Pokemon on top of your deck to search your deck for another Pokemon. While this wasn't incredibly limited, having to find both pieces at the same time was still not super easy, especially when considering that both of them share the same name, and you could therefore only play 4 total pieces of the same Legend Pokemon. This problem became even more glaring when the Pokemon TCG rotation to Heart Gold and Soul Silver onwards happened, and the only way to search for a Legend Pokemon was Pokemon Communication. But surely those struggles will be worth it if you eventually manage to get both pieces of your Pokemon Legend to your hand and you got to play it, right? The next problem was that most of their attacks weren't that great. Starting off with Ho-Oh Legend, it has this sacred rainbow Pokebody that turns every energy attached to it into a fire energy, which is pretty useful considering that its Bright Wing attack needs 4 of them total to deal 100 damage, and requires an energy to be discarded from itself. While 100 damage certainly wasn't bad at the time, the magic number was 130 to knock out most Pokemon. And considering that Ho-Oh Legend would most likely be your big attacker, considering the amount of setup it requires, turns it into a little bit of a letdown, considering that it wouldn't be able to deal with any late game threats. Lugia Legend fulfilled the role of a boss attacker way better, considering that it also had a self-exciting Pokepower in Ocean Grow, which lets you look at the top 5 cards of your deck, attach all energies you find to the Lugia Legend, and discard the rest of them. Its Elemental Blast attack deals 200 damage for 1 fire, 1 water, and 1 lightning energy, and requires you to discard 1 of each of them. The big problem here was that not only did Lugia require a lot of energies to attack, But because two-prize Pokemon weren't a thing back then when this card first came out, dealing 200 damage and having to lose a lot of resources for just one prize card wasn't worth it at all. The trade was never favorable in its favor. It also didn't help that the best card at the time was Luxray GL Level X, which could easily knock it out because of its lightning weakness. With the next set, Heart Gold Soul Silver Unleashed, Legend Pokemon became more viable, mainly due to them featuring two Pokemon and therefore also two attacks, making them more versatile than the previous Legends that only had one big hitting attack. The weakest duo of the legendary dogs was Raikou and Suicune Legend. For 2 lightning and 1 colorless energy, Thunderbolt Spear deals 150 damage, but also deals 50 damage to itself. Considering that it only has 160 HP and gives up 2 prizes, taking away close to 1/3 of your HP just to take 1 prize in most cases wasn't worth it. Its second attack, Aurora Gain, requires 1 energy and 2 colorless, and deals 50 damage, plus heals the Pokemon for 50. For 3 energies on a 2-prize Pokemon, that isn't particularly easy to get out. This attack was simply too bad, as many other Pokemon dealt more damage for less energy and required less setup. With Suicune and Entei Legend Pokemon finally started getting more viable. Its Torrent Blade attack requires 2 water energies and 1 colorless, and you get to choose one of your opponent's bench Pokemon and deal 100 damage to it. You also have to return 2 water energies attached to this Pokemon to your hand. For 1 fire energy and 2 colorless, Burst Inferno deals 80 damage and burns a defending Pokemon. Now, the reason why this card was one of the first semi-viable cards is that water was one of the few energy types that had a solid energy acceleration at the time, thanks to Feraligatr Prime from Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Its Rain Dance Pokepower lets you attach as many water energies as you want to your water Pokemon during your turn, which, thanks to its double typing, worked for Suicune and Entei Legend. Up next, and the first immediately viable card upon release, was Entei and Raikou Legend. Its Detonation Spin attack deals 90 damage for 1 fire, 1 colorless energy, and requires a discard of 1 fire energy attached to itself. Thunderfall deals 80 damage to every Pokemon in play that has a Pokepower for 1 lightning and 1 colorless energy. This makes it the easiest legend so far in terms of powering up due to only needing 2 energies for either attack. It is also important to note that during this era, most support Pokemon that had Pokepowers had 80 HP or less, meaning Thunderfall could close out a game in 1 attack towards the end. Up next are the Legend Pokemon from Heart Gold and Soul Silver Undaunted, and they immediately went up again in terms of their energy requirement. Starting off is Kyogre and Groudon Legend, needing 2 water energies and 2 colorless energies for its Mega Tidal Wave attack. Discard the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck, and then deals 30 damage to each of their bench Pokemon for every energy discarded this way. For 2 fighting and 2 colorless energies, Massive Eruptions discards the top 5 cards from your deck instead, and deals 100 damage for each energy discarded this way. While both of these attacks are incredibly luck-based, Mega Tidal Wave isn't too bad to mill your opponent's deck, but requires other tools to function properly as a control deck. Control also wasn't really an archetype at this point in time, and resource management wasn't really an important skill. The most hyped up card upon its reveal was Rayquaza and Deoxys Legend. As long as Rayquaza and Deoxys Space Virus is active, Pokemon that are knocked out by damage from one of Rayquaza and Deoxys Legend's attacks give up 1 extra prize card. Its attack, Ozone Buster, deals 150 damage for 2 fire, 1 lightning, and 1 colorless energy, and discards all fire energies attached to itself. This made it so that the prize trade, in theory, could be a fair one. The final set with Legend Pokemon was Heart Gold and Soul Silver Triumphant. Starting things off here is Darkrai and Cresselia Legend. Its Lost Crisis attack deals 100 damage, and you have to put 2 energy attached to it into the Lost Zone. If a Pokemon gets knocked out by damage from this attack, you also place that Pokemon and all cards attached to it into the Lost Zone, instead of the discard pile. Moon's Invite lets you move around damage on your opponent's Pokemon in play any way you like for 1 psychic energy. Closing things off are the 2 Diamond and Pearl cover legendaries Palkia and Dialga Legend. For 1 water energy and 2 colorless, Sudden Delete lets you put one of your Pokemon's Pokemon and all cards attached to it into their hand. Time Control requires 2 metal energies and 1 colorless, and puts the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck into their prize cards. You also have to discard all metal energies attached to this Pokemon. When looking at most of these attacks, especially the later ones, you might think that they aren't actually that bad, and that most of these Pokemon probably saw play at least at some point. And this is actually what a lot of people were thinking when those Pokemon were first revealed as well. Most of them have some of the best sounding attacks of all time, dealing massive amounts of damage to the bench, taking extra prize cards, or even increase the number of prize cards of your opponent. Most of them shared one problem, however: high energy requirements with very limited energy acceleration. Especially when these cards came out and the Diamond and Pearl and Platinum block were still around, most of the relevant meta decks were 1 prize Pokemon with attacks that required very little energy. Which is why most decks at the time that tried to use Legend Pokemon were simply overrun by those pre-existing decks. Some of them, however, managed to be meta relevant at some point. The first Legend Pokemon to see competitive play was Entei and Raikou Legend. Upon its release in Heart Gold and Soul Silver Unleashed, the best deck at the time was Luxray GL Level X paired with Garchomp C Level X. Luxray's Bright Look Pokepower lets you switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active Pokemon when you evolve it, and its Flash Impact attack deals 60 damage for 1 lightning and 1 colorless energy, and requires you to put 30 damage on one of your bench Pokemon. Garchomp C level X's Healing Breath Pokepower heals all damage from your SP Pokemon at play when you evolve it, and its Dragon Rush attack deals 80 damage to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon in play, but also requires you to discard 2 energies from it. The strategy of this deck was to quickly take cheap prize cards on your opponent's unevolved Pokemon, or their low HP support Pokemon, which is why Entei and Raikou Legend fit perfectly into it. Most of these low HP support Pokemon had 80 or less HP, which allowed Thunderfall to take multiple prize cards in one turn. And as the deck was already running Lightning Energy for Luxray GL level X, it didn't even require too many changes deck building wise. After that, it took more than a year and an entire rotation for the next Legend Pokemon to become competitively viable. In 2011, cards from the Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum era were no longer legal for play, and the addition of the Black and White expansion formed the 2011 World Championship format. That tournament was a spotlight moment for Legends. Both finals decks had a different one in them. The runner-up featured Suicune and Entei Legend in his Vileplume and Reuniclus deck. Vileplume, from Heart Gold and Soul Silver Undaunted, has the Allergy Flower Pokepower, which prevents both players from using any item cards from their hand. Reuniclus from the new Black and White set has the Damage Swap ability that lets you switch damage counters freely between your Pokemon as often as you like during your turn. The goal of the deck was to slow down your opponent with Vileplume while also having various high HP attackers in the active spot that could soak up damage. That damage would then be spread amongst the rest of your Pokemon until most of them had barely any HP left. Once a lot of the damage was accumulated on the board, Chansey would evolve into Blissey Prime with the Blissful Nurse Pokepower, which removes the damage from each of your Pokemon in play and discards all energies attached to Pokemon that were healed. In order to have solid Pokemon for each matchup, the deck had to play a variety of attackers to always have an option that can't be hit by weakness, and ideally hits the relevant matchups for weakness. 2 of the most prominent weaknesses were Water and Fire, which made Suicune and Entei Legend a perfect addition to the deck. It had everything the deck could want in a card: high HP, a decent enough attack, and relevant typing to counter many top decks. The first place deck used a combination of Magnezone Prime and Emboar from Black and White. Magnezone's Magnetic Draw Pokepower lets you, once per turn, draw cards until you have 6 cards in your hand. Its Lost Burn attack deals 50 damage for each energy that you put from your Pokemon into the Lost Zone. The attack itself requires 1 lightning and 1 colorless energy. Emboar's Inferno Fandango ability lets you attach a fire energy from your hand to your Pokemon in play as often as you like during your turn. The strategy was to flood your board with energies to deal massive amounts of damage with Lost Burn. One particular legend was a great addition to the deck due to its lightning and fire basic energy requirement. Rayquaza and Deoxys' Legend Ozone Buster could be used perfectly in the deck thanks to Space Virus that got to pick up more than just 1 prize per attack. Some might think that this was the start of something great for Legend Pokemon, but as quickly as they rose to the top, they fell again. Rayquaza and Deoxys Legend, as well as Entei and Suicune Legend, stayed relevant in those decks respectively for a bit, but as people started adapting their lists, they lost some of their power, and as the next few sets came around, were completely phased out of the game. Some rogue decks popped up here and there, most prominently a different version of Vileplume and Reuniclus that made use of Kyogre and Groudon Legend to run your opponent out of cards, but in terms of top tier meta-relevant legends, we're nearing the end. By the time the next World Championship came around, Legends had long been completely gone from the metagame. In the earliest days of the Pokemon TCG, there was often a huge difference in power level between basic Pokemon that couldn't evolve and evolutionary Pokemon. Many evolution Pokemon were simply outclassed by basics, or lined up extremely badly into the established early metagame. So today, we're going to look at some of the worst evolution Pokemon from the first 3 sets of the Pokemon TCG. Kicking things off at number 10, we have Marowak. This Stage 1 Pokemon has 60 HP and weak attacks. For 2 fighting energy, Bonemerang makes you flip 2 coins and deals 30 damage for each heads. Also for 2 fighting and 1 colorless, Call for Friends lets you search your deck for any basic fighting type Pokemon and put it directly onto your bench. To understand what makes this card bad, we have to look at Bonemerang's average damage output. While the attack can potentially deal 60 damage for 2 energy, in the early days of the Pokemon TCG, Pokemon cards had a lot less HP than they do now. An attack that dealt 60 damage set up a 2-hit KO on almost every card in the game, and with some damage modifiers could even 1-hit KO meta-relevant threats with 70 HP. Unfortunately, since you have to flip 2 heads to deal 60 damage, there's only a 25% chance for the attack to be this powerful. Half the time you use Bonemerang, it will only deal 30 damage. While 30 damage for 2 energy isn't bad, it's not an effect worth evolving into a Stage 1 Pokemon over. Marowak's viability isn't made any better by its second attack. To illustrate how bad Call for Friends actually is, take a look at a modern card in Hisuian Basculin. For 0 energy cost, this card's Gather the Crew attack lets you put any 2 basic Pokemon from your deck onto your bench for no energy reminder. Marowak has the same attack with a restriction, and it gets 1 less Pokemon, and costs 3 energy cards, and you need to set up a Stage 1 Pokemon. Call for Friend wouldn't be used if it could put any fighting type Pokemon from your deck onto your bench either. The cost is far too unreasonable for such a bad effect. It's also worth noting that Marowak was generally outclassed by Hitmonchan, a card with better HP, lower cost attacks, and a basic Pokemon. Marowak did have some different utility compared to Hitmonchan, most notably its non-psychic weakness and electric resistance, but this isn't enough to give Marowak a legitimate competitive niche. And at number 9, we have another fighting type in Dugtrio. For 2 fighting and 1 colorless energy, Slash deals 40 damage. Also for 4 fighting energy, Earthquake deals 70 damage to defending Pokemon and 10 to all other Pokemon on each player's bench. Dugtrio has some very good merits, but falls short of viability due to many of the issues surrounding evolution Pokemon in the early days of the Pokemon TCG. Slash dealing 40 damage is actually fairly strong. Many powerful colorless and electric type Pokemon were present in the metagame, so the 40 damage would often be 80 damage. When dealing 80 damage, Slash could KO popular Pokemon like Wigglytuff and Electabuzz. Its electric type resistance also meant opposing Electabuzz couldn't meaningfully threaten Dugtrio. However, much like the previous Marowak, Hitmonchan was a far better card used far more frequently. Hitmonchan's Special Punch has the exact same energy cost and damage as Slash, but on a far better Pokemon. While the card lacks an electric resistance, most players wouldn't want to leave fighting weak Pokemon on their active spot since a Jab could deal 40 damage for a single energy with weakness. Hitmonchan having Jab was the main reason to never consider playing Dugtrio. Since it took 3 turns of energy attachments to set up Slash, you could use 3 Jabs over the same time frame. Using Jab 3 turns in a row actually deals 20 more damage than not attacking while setting up Slash. This same issue is made even worse when trying to set up Earthquake. An attack which dealt 70 damage and put 10 damage on all of your opponent's bench Pokemon was fantastic, as many strong Pokemon had 70 HP, and the spread damage would bring higher HP Pokemon down to 70 HP. However, since it took 4 turns of energy attachments to use, Earthquake was wildly impractical. You could use a card like Electrode, whose Pokemon power lets you KO itself and attach it to one of your Pokemon as a special energy, which counts as 2 of those chosen type, but this would still leave your Pokemon heavily vulnerable to super energy removal. Much like many other cards on this list, Dugtrio was just too slow to set up and outclassed by a superior basic Pokemon. And at number 8, we have Electrode. For 2 colorless energy, this card's tackle attack does 20 damage. Its second attack, Chain Lightning, is far better. For 3 electric energy, Chain Lightning deals 20 damage plus 10 to each bench Pokemon that shares a type with the defending Pokemon, unless the defending Pokemon is colorless type. There's nothing interesting to talk about in regards to tackle. An attack which deals 20 damage for 2 energy simply isn't good when basic Pokemon can deal the same damage for a single energy. In the Pokemon TCG's early history, there weren't a lot of ways to damage a bench Pokemon outside of bringing it to the active spot with Gust of Wind. Since the damage to the bench is very valuable, it lets you circumvent your opponent's active Pokemon and attack whatever you want. But most bench damaging attacks were horribly overcosted. Chain Energy is a shining example of an attack that would be significantly better if it costs 1 less energy. Dealing 20 damage to your opponent's active Pokemon for 3 energy is simply awful. Not to mention, the 3 energy attack costs made setting up an Electrode extremely vulnerable against super energy removal, as this single trainer card could set you behind 2 entire turns of progress. Chain Lightning would also damage your own Pokemon that shared a type with the defending Pokemon, giving it another brutal downside. Also, colorless type Pokemon like Wigglytuff were extremely powerful and common in the metagame due to the versatility. Against one of these Wigglytuff decks, Electrode was dead weight. Much like every other card on this list, Electrode was also outclassed by a superior basic Pokemon of the same type, in this case Electabuzz. Electrode was not only bad, but wholly outclassed. And at number 7, we have Vileplume. This Pokemon has both a middling attack and a bad ability. Once per turn, with its heal Pokemon power, you can flip a coin. If heads, you get to heal 10 damage from one of your Pokemon. For 3 grass energy, Petal Dance lets you flip 3 coins and deal 40 damage for each heads. While Vileplume can be a decent attacker with solid utility, all parts of this card being tied to coin flips makes it one of the most unreliable Pokemon to use. The heal Pokemon power can be very strong. Oftentimes in the Pokemon TCG, the difference between getting a 2-hit KO or not is a single damage counter. Having a card which could reliably disrupt 2-hit KO math isn't the most impactful, but would garner some kind of niche. However, since heal needs you to win a 50-50 coin flip, the effect won't actually have any benefit half the time. The format of the game's early history was also slow enough that having your 2-hit KO become a 3-hit KO wasn't particularly worrying. While you could set up multiple Vileplume on your bench to give you more chances for heal to actually happen, or increase the healing you could do in a turn, getting a single Stage 2 Pokemon to play already took time and effort, due to needing each previous stage of the Pokemon. The early stages like Oddish were incredibly vulnerable to being switched into the active spot by Gust of Wind and KO'd. Petal Dance has a similar issue with unreliability. While capping at 120 damage is excellent, and one-hit KOs all Pokemon in the format, there's only a 1 in 8 chance of flipping all 3 heads needed for that massive damage. Vileplume is also vulnerable to energy disruption due to its high attack cost. There's better uses of 3 energy that aren't setting up an attack as unreliable as Petal Dance. If you could always flip heads on a coin toss, Vileplume would be an outstanding card, but that's just not how probability works. Vileplume will frequently not function to its full potential, and never saw competitive play as a result. And at number 6, we have Nidoking. This Stage 2 Pokemon has 90 HP and 2 bad attacks. For 1 Grass and 2 Colorless Energy, Thrash deals 30 damage, and you flip a coin. If heads, the attack deals 10 more damage. If tails, Thrash deals 10 damage to Nidoking. Also for 3 Grass Energy, Toxic deals 20 damage and poisons a defending Pokemon. When poisoned with Toxic, the Pokemon's owner puts 2 damage counters on it between turns instead of the usual 1. Thrash is a fairly decent attack with reasonable damage. Since double Colorless Energy is in the format, Thrash can actually be used after only 2 energy attachments instead of 3. The potential for 40 damage off of just 2 attachments is powerful, but not as a payoff for a Stage 2 Pokemon. Electabuzz has an attack that is functionally identical in Thunder Punch, but costs 1 less colorless energy. Electabuzz uses the Thunder Punch as a means to deal high damage as early as possible, something that can't be reliably done with an evolution Pokemon like Nidoking. A basic Pokemon having a wholly superior version of attack of a Stage 2 Pokemon is a good sign that the Stage 2 isn't particularly strong. Its other attack, Toxic, is also fairly weak. Since Toxic Poison effect deals 20 damage in between turns as long as the defending Pokemon doesn't switch out of the active spot or evolve, the first time you use Toxic on a Pokemon, it'll deal 20 damage plus 20 more in between the turns. If your opponent's Pokemon doesn't retreat or evolve during their turn, it'll take 20 more damage. If your opponent can't switch the active Pokemon during their turn, and you get to deal 40 damage in between turns, Nidoking is actually pretty good. The problem with Toxic is that the attack relies on your opponent not doing anything to maximize its value. While evolution cards aren't particularly common in the metagame, many players are okay with discarding energies attached to active Pokemon in order to retreat it, especially since most strong decks use Pokemon with either retreat cost of 1 or no retreat cost at all. If you aren't dealing more than 40 damage to Toxic, the attack becomes very average and not worth building your deck around. Another important aspect of Nidoking that led it to being on this list is that it has a Psychic type weakness. The early Pokemon TCG metagame was dominated by strong Psychic types in Mewtwo, and Pokemon used to counter it like Mew. Mewtwo was a format warping card due to its immense strength, and forced decks to either play Mewtwo or adapt to beat it. And because of Nidoking's Psychic type weakness, it has a terrible matchup into these dominant Psychic decks. Nidoking took too long to set up, was the middling win setup, and had a terrible matchup into some of the format's best decks, earning it a spot on this list. And speaking of cards that got shut out of the competitive format by Mewtwo, at number 5 we have Machamp. With its Strike Back Pokemon power, whenever this card was damaged by an attack, you would put 1 damage counter on your opponent's attacking Pokemon. For 3 fighting and 1 colorless energy, Seismic Toss dealt 60 damage. While being a fighting type Pokemon meant that Machamp could hit for weakness against many strong colorless or electric type Pokemon, it also gave this card a crippling Psychic type weakness. While Strike Back makes low damage attacks bad against Machamp, as you'll get more damage counters out on the Pokemon power over time, Mewtwo's Psyburn will deal 80 damage and 2-hit KO Machamp. When Strike Back only puts 2 damage counters on a Pokemon, it isn't a very good Pokemon power. It's also worth noting that Strike Back doesn't work if Machamp was affected by a status condition when attacked. So effects like Magmar's Smog attack could actually prevent any damage counters from being put on your opponent's Pokemon. Of course, a bad Mewtwo matchup isn't the only bad part about this card. Much like all other 4-cost attacks talked about previously, the card was easily disrupted by super energy removal. Machamp, like most other fighting type Pokemon released at the time, was also outclassed by Hitmonchan due to the basic Pokemon being able to attack far sooner and more efficiently. Simply put, the early format of the Pokemon TCG couldn't be more hostile to Machamp. And at number 4, we have Victory Bell. For 1 Grass Energy, Lure lets you switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active Pokemon. For 2 Grass Energy, Acid deals 20 damage and prevents a defending Pokemon from retreating if you win a coin flip. Victory Bell doesn't have the same issues against super energy removal that many other bad evolution Pokemon do, since its attacks have very low energy costs. Unfortunately, those attacks aren't worth using. While both of Victory Bell's attacks have decent utility, there are other cards which outperform these attacks. Lure is just Gust of Wind, but as an attack. While Gust of Wind is a very strong effect, it's best used when you switch a Pokemon you want to damage into the active spot. Since Lure counts as your only attack for the turn, it can't be used nearly as well as the trainer card. If you use Lure to bring up a vulnerable Pokemon to the active spot, your opponent has their whole turn to get that Pokemon back onto their bench before you have a chance to attack it. Acid also doesn't do particularly much, and would have likely been balanced if it prevented your opponent from retreating without needing to flip coins. As is, Acid is an unreliable means to lock a Pokemon in the active spot while dealing alright damage. There isn't anything interesting about Acid. Its effect is unreliable and not very impactful whenever it works, and doesn't deal significant damage to justify setting up a Stage 2 Pokemon. In fact, Acid is far worse than other lock tools like Lickitung's Tongue Wrap, which deals 10 damage for 1 energy and could prevent your opponent's Pokemon from doing anything by paralyzing it. There's just nothing worthwhile about Victory Bell, so it earns a spot on this list. And at number 3, we have Hypno. For 1 Psychic Energy, Prophecy lets you look at the top 3 cards of your deck and put them back in any order. For 3 Psychic Energy, Dark Mind deals 30 damage to the active Pokemon and 10 damage to your opponent's bench Pokemon. If Hypno were a basic Pokemon, it may have well had a very small niche in Psychic type decks. As a Stage 1 Pokemon, this card was one of the worst possible Pokemon to bring to a competitive event in the game's early history. Something immediately obvious to a player experienced with the format is that Hypno's attack costs almost perfectly match Mewtwo's while having inferior effects, where Energy Absorption lets you proactively accelerate energy to Mewtwo as early as the first turn, and allows for fast Cybern attacks that 2-hit KO much of the metagame. Prophecy lets you pick the best card on top of your deck to draw on your next turn, and Dark Mind can't 2-hit KO common 70 HP Pokemon. Since it's not really fair to compare a terrible card to one of the best cards at the time, here's a Dark Golduck that released 1 set after Hypno. Not only does Third Eye draw 3 cards for a single energy, although it has a slight cost, Super Psy deals 20 more damage, which picks up 2-hit KOs against far more Pokemon than Dark Mind could. Hypno having the superior 90 HP doesn't really matter since its Psychic type weakness makes it far more vulnerable against many common threats. Overall, Hypno is just bad and outclassed in every way by multiple different cards. And at number 2, we have Amistar. This Stage 2 Pokemon has 2 attacks that are both downgrades from other Pokemon. For 1 Water and 1 Colorless Energy, Water Gun deals 20 damage plus 10 more for each water energy attached to itself that isn't paying for the attack's cost. What this means is that any water energy attached to this card beyond the second will add 10 damage to Water Gun's attack. Also, you can't add more than 20 damage to Water Gun by its own effect. For 2 water energy, its second attack Spike Cannon makes you flip 2 coins, and deals 30 damage for each hex. Spike Cannon is bad for the same reasons Marowak's Boomerang was at the start of this list. The damage simply isn't reliable, and thus isn't worth using on a regular basis. This downside is especially bad since Amistar is a Stage 2 Pokemon and takes an entire extra evolution card to get going. If you were trying to play Amistar, you could mostly use Water Gun for its more reliable damage output and ease of setting up. With Blastoise's Rain Dance Pokemon power, you could attach as many water energy cards from your hand to your Pokemon as you'd like. This makes powering up Water Gun to its full 40 damage very easy. However, Blastoise has a superior version of Water Gun as its attack. For 3 water energy, a Hydro Pump deals 40 damage plus 10 more for each excess water energy attached to itself, capping out at 60 damage. With Amistar's attack being outclassed by the Pokemon that best enables it, there's no reason to even consider using this card in a competitive setting. What's ironic though is that Amistar isn't even the worst fossil Pokemon on this list. Finally, as the worst evolution Pokemon from the earliest Pokemon sets, we have Kabutops. For 2 fighting energy, this card can use Slash for 30 damage. For 4 fighting energy, Absorb deals 40 damage and then heals Kabutops for half the damage dealt this way. Kabutops having the Absorb attack shows that the card was somewhat intended to be this hard-hitting Pokemon that would be difficult to KO through its self-healing. Sadly, the card only had about 60 HP, which is a miserably low amount for a Stage 2 Pokemon. Even if you manage to set up Absorb and get multiple attacks off, the low HP stat meant the card could get KO'd by many attacks. Most notably, Wigglytuff, which was able to deal 60 damage to do the wave as long as the player had a full bench of 5 Pokemon. For a Stage 2 Pokemon that takes multiple cards to even get going on the field, having a bad matchup into one of the most played Pokemon in the metagame was an insurmountable obstacle towards meta relevance. For what it's worth, Kabutops' Absorb would always one-hit KO Wigglytuff in return due to the latter's fighting type weakness. But this would be simply too unrealistic to set up. Since it takes 4 energy to use Absorb, your opponent could simply use Gust of Wind to KO any Kabutops before you could set up all the energy necessary. Even if you used a card like Electrode to speed up energy attachments at the cost of your opponent getting a prize card, Kabutops is just too easy to KO. In the Sun and Moon era of the Pokemon TCG, Prism Star cards are a unique mechanic introduced in the Ultra Prism expansion. You could only play one copy of each Prism Star card in your deck, and if they ever left the field, they got put into the Lost Zone instead. Since you could only play one of each card, they were extremely powerful compared to other individual one-prize Pokemon. However, that doesn't mean all of them saw competitive success. Today, we're going to look over some of the worst Prism Star cards, in fact. So starting off the list at number 10, we have a Lance Prism Star. This card's effects lets you cheat out 2 Pokemon straight from your deck. If any of your Pokemon were knocked out during your last turn, you can take any 2 Dragon-type Pokemon from your deck and put them straight onto your bench regardless of their stage. This card was usable in a wide variety of deck lists in both the standard and expanded format. While it's widely usable, that doesn't mean every single deck wants this effect, as whether or not you'd want to run Lance Prism Star in your deck is entirely dependent on what dragon types you could play. For most of the card's time in the standard format, it never saw serious play due to not having many good cards to cheat out. Once the Team Up Dragonite released though, some players opted to use a supporter in their control decks. Dragonite's Fast Call ability lets you search any supporter card from your deck, a tool some control players appreciate having access to. With control decks having many one-of supporter cards, being able to use Fast Call to search them when needed was useful. If you wanted to use Lance Prism Star more aggressively, you could play a Salamence GX and Salamence from your deck, with the GX giving you Pokemon free retreat and the regular Salamence letting you switch your opponent's active Pokemon as long as it was in the active spot. Staging a comeback became a bit easier. In the expanded format, Lance Prism Star saw some usage to play a Alolan Executor, and recently has been used in expanded Giratina V-Star decks to play the namesake attacker straight from the deck. As better evolution dragon types are printed into the game, Lance Prism Star will only get better. And at number 9, we have Solgaleo Prism Star. For 1 Metal Energy, Radiant Star lets you attach a Metal Energy from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon in any way you like for each Pokemon your opponent has in play. For 4 Metal Energy, Corona Impact dealt 160 damage, but Solgaleo couldn't attack during your next turn. It's the Radiant Star attack that gave Solgaleo Prism Star its competitive niche early on. In the standard format of the time, Duskmane Necrozma GX was a fairly popular deck that sought to power up Duskmane's Meteor Tempest early and consistently. When going second, after your opponent placed cards onto their bench, Radiant Star was capable of attaching enough energies to Duskmane for Meteor Tempest on its own. Even in the late game, if for some reason you weren't able to set up Magnezone, the deck's usual means of attaching multiple energies per turn, Radiant Star helped enable attacks. Magnezone also meant that Corona Impact was easy to access as an extra attacking option if needed. Solgaleo Prism Star also had a small niche in wall decks. These decks played Pokemon that were extremely difficult to KO while setting up a win condition like Unknown's Hand ability. In wall strategies, Solgaleo's 160 HP on a Steel-type Pokemon meant it was a huge pain to KO. With the damage reduction effects like Lucario and Melmetal's Full Metal Wall GX attack and Metal Frying Pan, it could take upwards of 220 damage in a single attack to KO Solgaleo. If your opponent wasn't able to knock it out, the wall player had an extensive amount of healing options to restore the damage. Although it was a small niche in a very specific subset of decks, the role was legitimate. Having these roles meant that Solgaleo is only at number 9 on this list, and paints a picture of how good most Prism Star cards are. And at number 8, we have Giratina Prism Star. This Pokemon has 160 HP, the Chaotic Star ability, and the Crisis Dive attack. When Giratina is put onto the bench, Chaotic Star lets you attach up to 2 Psychic Energies from your hand to it. The Crisis Dive attack costs 4 Psychic Energy, and deals 160 damage at the cost of discarding 2 Psychic Energies attached to Giratina. Having a basic, single prize Pokemon in your deck that accelerates energy to itself while dealing massive damage could significantly skew a prize trade with your opponent. If you use Crisis Dive to KO a 2-prize Pokemon, and they can only KO your 1-prize Pokemon, Giratina would put you significantly ahead. In the standard formats where Giratina Prism Star was legal, it fit especially well into the premier Psychic-type deck of the time. These decks using Malamar's Psychic Recharge to attach Psychic Energies from the discard pile to their Pokemon to create a constant stream of strong attackers. If your Giratina Prism Star survived to your next turn, Malamar could recharge the attack again and allow for multiple high-damage Crisis Dives. Thanks to Chaotic Star, it was also easy to attach the initial energy to Malamar decks, playing an above-average count of energy cards. The issue with Giratina isn't that the card is bad, but that it simply is outclassed as a single-prize attacker by other Psychic options. Malamar decks had no shortage of efficient one-prize attackers. Funnily enough, the non-Prism Star Giratina was the most reliable option due to its Distortion Door ability, allowing you to put it onto your bench from your discard pile. Because you'd always be able to get Giratina back after it gets KO'd, and its Shadow Impact attack 2-hit KO most Pokemon GX, it was often better to use Giratina over Giratina Prism Star. If your goal was to have a 4 energy attack cost that dealt massive damage, Lunala Prism Star was seen as a more desirable option due to its Size Storm attack having a far higher damage cap than Crisis Dive. Once again, Giratina Prism Star is a decent card. There's just better options that stopped it from seeing more regular play. And at number 7, we have Cyrus Prism Star, the first Prism Star supporter on this list. This supporter has the unique effect of making your opponent shuffle all but 2 of their bench Pokemon into their deck, but you can only play it if your active Pokemon was a Water or Steel type. There is no supporter card in the history of the game with a comparable effect to Cyrus Prism Star. Even so, there were a few factors holding the card back from having more success than it seemingly should have had. Firstly, the restriction on being able to play it only if you had a certain type of Pokemon greatly limited the amount of decks you could even play the supporter in. When the card first released, it saw very occasional play with Glaceon GX or White Kyurem. Despite the later release of Jirachi, a Steel-type Pokemon that saw play in almost every deck as a consistency boosting tool, Cyrus Prism Star failed to catch on due to its other downside. As your opponent got to pick the Pokemon they shuffled back into the deck, they'd always get rid of cards that just weren't needed anymore. Not to mention that plenty of decks existed at the time which could function perfectly with just 1 or 2 bench Pokemon. The only time Cyrus Prism Star was ever going to pull its weight as your one supporter per turn was against decks which needed every single one of their bench Pokemon. The standard format of the time simply wasn't fit for an effect like Cyrus's. And at number 6, we have Luzamine Prism Star. This supporter has the effect to prevent all damage dealt to your Ultra Beast Pokemon during your opponent's next turn, but could only be played if they have exactly 3 or 4 prize cards remaining. On anything but a Prism Star card, certain decks having access to supporter which prevents all damage would be pretty broken. Unfortunately, since you can only play a single copy of Luzamine in your deck, most Ultra Beast decks just didn't care about it. The restriction on when you can play Luzamine meant enabling the card was quite awkward, as you needed a way to find it before or on the 3 or 4 prize card turn. As Luzamine Prism Star as a supporter, you either needed to draw it before your opponent went down to 3 or 4 prizes, or have Pokemon abilities that make finding it on the needed turn much easier. The issue of needing your once per turn supporter usage was also exacerbated by how Blasphalon, the Ultra Beast deck at the time, played. Since Blasphalon was a single prize attacker that sought to take big multiple prize KOs before getting knocked out, you usually had to set up a new one on your turn. In order to power up its Fireball Circus attack turn after turn, the deck played Welder. You pretty much had to use Welder as your supporter every turn, so you had no opportunity to play Luzamine. Luzamine's effect is absurdly strong. It just didn't fit in the deck it was meant to support. And at number 5, we have Darkrai Prism Star. With its Nightmare Star ability, when you play Darkrai from your hand onto the bench, you can attach up to 2 Darkness Energy from your hand to it. It also has the Abyssal Sleep attack for 4 Darkness Energy, which deals 120 damage and puts a defending Pokemon to sleep. While that Pokemon is asleep, your opponent has to flip 2 coins in order to try and cure the status condition. Even though it shares the same good ability as the previously mentioned Giratina, Darkrai Prism Star never had a good deck to slot into. For the first few iterations of the standard format the card was in, there was no deck that needed a way to put multiple Darkness Energy into play with Nightmare Star. After the release of Weevil GX, a card which lets you move around your energy from Darkrai to other, more powerful attackers, Nightmare Star's extra energy lets you quickly establish the energy cost needed for Darkrai and Umbreon GX, or Sableye and Tyranitar GX. In these decks, Darkrai could also be used as a single prize attacker if need be due to the flexibility provided by Shadow Connection. Sadly, Weavile GX decks were never able to catch on to the metagame due to being overall weaker than other decks in the meta. Darkrai also couldn't find a niche in the expanded format, where Turbo Dark, a deck that wanted to spam the field with as much darkness energies as possible, had better means to do so than Nightmare Star. With item cards like Dark Patch and Max Elixir that played energy from the discard pile and deck respectively, a card that got energy out of your hand wasn't needed. The Weavile deck that has seen competitive play with Darkrai Prism Star and its niche was legitimate, so the card isn't higher on this list. And at number 4, we have Arceus Prism Star. Its first Law ability prevented all effects of attacks done to it. For a single colorless energy, Trinity Star dealt 30 damage and lets you attach up to 3 basic energy cards from your deck to your Pokemon in any way you like, but you could only use it if you had a Water, Grass, and Electric-type Pokemon on your bench. Much like the aforementioned Cyrus Prism Star, it's that harsh restriction that limited which decks could take advantage of Trinity Star's incredible effect. Using a single Trinity Star to start off the game puts you enormously ahead of your opponent in terms of energy in play. However, just because the effect was hard to take advantage of, doesn't mean it was impossible. The card first saw play in a deck revolving around Xerneas' Rainbow Force attack, which dealt 10 damage plus 30 more for each type of Pokemon on your bench. Xerneas decks played a multitude of different types in order to boost Rainbow Force's damage as much as possible. Notably, the deck regularly ran Galvantula and Valcania on EX. Having both of these Pokemon in play fulfilled the requirement to use Trinity Star, although it wasn't possible to do so on the first turn, as Galvantula was a Stage 1 Pokemon. The second deck to see competitive success using Arceus Prism Star was decks using White Kyurem. In this deck, Trinity Star was one of the best ways to quickly set up the 3 energy needed for Kyurem's Freezing Flames attack. The deck utilized cards like Zebstrika as a draw engine and Pheromosa for its free retreat to provide all 3 of the needed types for Trinity Star. Once your deck got 3 energy in play, Wishful Baton allowed you to move it onto your other Pokemon after the attached Pokemon got KO'd. With multiple batons, you could easily chain together Freezing Flames every turn. Once the Tag Team Pokemon were released, the deck fell out of the metagame due to being unable to compete with the heightened power level of the format. But for a very brief time, Arceus Prism Star had a solid role in a deck presented at the competitive level. Had the deck not been power crept so quickly, it's likely Arceus Prism Star would have had more competitive placements. And at number 3, we have Lysander Prism Star. With this card, you could put cards in your opponent's discard pile into the Lost Zone up to the number of Fire-type Pokemon you have in play. There are a few reasons as to why this card doesn't see much, if any, serious tournament play. Firstly, like many of the Prism Star supports on this list, it has a specific requirement that seriously limits its usability in a majority of decks. Fire-type decks, especially during the standard format Lysander Prism Star was legal in, were incredibly fast, aggressive decks using cards like Welder to accelerate energy onto their attackers. These decks did not need a card to put their opponent's discard into the Lost Zone. In fact, there were very, very few decks that even remotely wanted this effect. While there have been discard pile reliant strategies throughout the history of the Pokemon TCG, simply putting cards into the Lost Zone up to the number of Pokemon you have with a specific type doesn't really affect their ability to play in a meaningful way. The only time the deck has seen tournament success was in a control deck using Magcargo GX, and Oricorio. In this deck, Lysander Prism Star was a tech option to beat the controlled mirror match by putting their opponent's supporters that they loot with Cynthia and Caitlyn into the Lost Zone. Something important to note about this niche is that Lysander Prism Star sees competition over it with Girafarage, whose Get Lost attack puts 2 cards from your opponent's discard pile into the Lost Zone for 1 colorless energy. When it comes to disrupting various supporter loops control decks seek to use, Get Lost's ability to Lost Zone more cards over multiple terms is greatly preferred, since control strategies will rarely try to KO it. While there's no damage coming Girafarage's way, it's free to sit in the active spot, getting rid of the discarded cards. The card is so strong versus control strategies that in the expanded format where Girafarage is still legal, it occasionally sees play in non-control decks like Arceus V-Star to help shore up their matchup against the archetype. Lysander Prism Star is outclassed in what you'd want to use it for, but it does have a single high-level tournament placement, so it only gets number 3 on this list. And at number 2 in this list, we have Latios Prism Star. This Dragon-type Pokemon has a single attack. For 2 colorless energy, Dragon Fleet deals 50 damage for each of your Dragon-type evolution Pokemon in play. At this point in the list, the Prism Star cards we're going to talk about just never had a deck to see play in. Dragon Fleet wants you to build your strategy around having multiple Dragon-type evolution cards in play to maximize its damage output. For Latios Prism Star's time in the standard format, no deck that wanted to utilize multiple evolution Dragon types existed. While there were good cards that supported the Dragon type like Xenia, Lance Prism Star, and Dragon Talon, this type of deck never caught on. The main issue with building around Dragon types is their attacks usually require multiple different types of energy to use. For example, Rayquaza GX, the best Dragon type card at the time, needs both grass and electric energy to use its attacks. The other issue with Latios specifically was that the best Dragon type attackers were basic Pokemon. Decks like Rayquaza GX didn't use any supplemental evolution Pokemon that could increase Dragon Fleet's damage, so Latios was never considered. Evolution Dragons just weren't played during the standard format, so Latios Prism Star never had a deck to see play in. And finishing off this list, the number 1 worst Prism Star card in Pokemon TCG is Celebi Prism Star. This Pokemon has the Time Distortion attack that allows you to devolve as many of your bench Pokemon as you like to the previous stage for a single colorless energy. Its second attack, Leech Seed, doesn't matter at all towards its viability or lack thereof, and isn't worth talking about. The concept behind why you'd want to devolve your own Pokemon is so that you can reuse strong on evolution abilities. While there are certainly good abilities to reuse, it's generally not worth using an attack in order to devolve your own Pokemon. For instance, mill decks leveraging Rhyperion's toppling wind ability use Super Scoop Up to re-evolve their Pokemon. By using Celebi Prism Star, you had to find both an energy and attack, meaning you couldn't set up another Pokemon or use another attack in the process. Not to mention that Celebi only had 90 HP, so it was vulnerable to getting KO'd after using Time Distortion a single time. Once Celebi got knocked out, due to the Prism Star mechanics, you'd never be able to get it back either. There was no deck that wanted the effect of Time Distortion. Due to having no niche whatsoever, Celebi Prism Star is the worst Prism Star Pokemon in the Pokemon TCG. In the Pokemon TCG, Stadium cards are a special type of trainer card that stays in play until another Stadium is played and has effects that apply to both players. Today, we're going to look at some of the worst Stadium cards. While there have been many incredible Stadium cards throughout the years, there's plenty more that are genuinely terrible. And kicking off list at number 10, we have Cinnabar City Gym, one of the first Stadium cards to be released. It's a Stadium card with the effect to remove a Water-type weakness from any Blaine's Pokemon in play. For context, let's take a look at Blaine's Ninetales, a Pokemon released in the same set. Pokemon cards with an in-game trainer's name was a set mechanic intended to make new decks with interesting synergies. Cinnabar City Gym's competitive viability struggled, as removing a Pokemon's weakness is not a good effect to build an entire deck around. Although cards with the ability to negate weaknesses have seen meta play, such as Weakness Policy, these kinds of effects being on Stadium cards make it significantly worse. Since most decks play at least a few Stadium cards, it's too easy for your opponent to remove a defensive Stadium from play. As such, it's incredibly difficult to get any value out of Stadiums that don't immediately provide some utility on your own turn. Another issue about this card's design is that not all of Blaine's Pokemon can actually benefit from its defensive effect. For example, Blaine's Kangaskhan doesn't even have a Water-type weakness. It's also not the only Blaine's Pokemon without a Water weakness. The poor design of only preventing weakness of one type meant that if you wanted to build around some of Blaine's Pokemon, the card that was meant to synergize well with them didn't actually do anything. Even if your Pokemon did have a Water weakness, there was almost no guarantee to be able to play against a Water-type deck. If you played against Pokemon of any other type, your Stadium that you intended to be a key point of the deck is now useless, unless you need to get rid of an opponent's Stadium card. Even with all of these poor aspects, Cinnabar City Gym actually saw a small amount of competitive play due to the existence of two other cards, Blaine's Arcanine and Feraligatr. During the Team Rocket to Neo Revelation format, Blaine's Arcanine was one of the best attackers you could play because of its Firestorm attack. This attack costs 4 energy and deals 120 damage at the cost of discarding 3 energies attached to itself. At the time, Firestorm dealt enough damage to one-hit KO all relevant Pokemon in the format. Cinnabar City Gym found a niche in Arcanine decks since one of the format's other most threatened attackers was Feraligatr, a water type whose deck played little to no Stadium cards. In the Feraligatr matchup specifically, the ability to remove Arcanine's weakness to water would be crucial to avoid one-hit KOs from Feraligatr's Riptide attack. Cinnabar City Gym may be bad and a poorly designed card, but it did have a legitimate niche, leaving it at only number 10 on this list. And at number 9, we have Lake Boundary, one of the strangest Stadium cards. When in play, this Stadium has the effect to apply weakness for each Pokemon in play as ×2. What makes Lake Boundary so weird is that for a vast majority of the Pokemon TCG's history, weakness is applied as a 2x by default. The only time this wasn't true was during the Diamond and Pearl era of the TCG. At the time, weakness for all Pokemon was additive instead. As an example, if you attacked Claydol with a Grass-type attack, it would only deal 20 extra damage. Ironically, this Stadium did see a respectable amount of play during the 2008 Worlds format. That format was heavily dominated by decks built around Gardevoir from the Secret Wonders expansion. In the mirror match, Lake Boundary saw play as a way to enable your own Gardevoir to one-hit KO your opponent's Gardevoir. Without the 2x weakness, this wasn't possible, as Psychic Lock would go from 60 to 90 damage instead of 60 to 120. Other decks that were capable of using multiple different types of attackers also enjoyed the damage boost. Decks like Evolutions using Leafeon level X and a bunch of other Pokemon that evolved from Eevee appreciated the extra damage. Unfortunately, as better Stadium cards and more Pokemon that naturally had a 2x weakness were released, Lake Boundary fell out of the format. It also began to see direct competition for the ability to apply weakness as 2x with Lucario GL, whose Boundary Aura Pokebody had the exact same function. Lucario also had a few advantages over Lake Boundary, such as being searchable off of Bebe Search or through Cyrus's Conspiracy, adding SP Radar. Despite having seen competitive play in the most important and highest level Pokemon tournament, this effect is technically useless throughout a vast majority of the game's history, making it one of the worst Stadium cards. And at number 8, we have Pokemon Park, a card with the simple effect of restoring 1 damage counter from your bench Pokemon whenever an energy is attached to it from the hand. There are multiple reasons as to why it never saw serious competitive play. The first reason this card never saw serious competitive play is that damage restoration only came into effect if you attach an energy to a Pokemon. In practice, this meant the player using Pokemon Park would have to use 2 cards from their hand as well as their once per turn energy attachment to heal. The heal also only came into effect if you attach energy to a bench Pokemon and not the active one. So you couldn't even attempt to heal an active Pokemon at risk of being KO'd the following turn unless you managed to retreat it. Another downside was that restoring 1 damage every turn for only 1 Pokemon simply isn't very good. While it's possible that 1 damage counter could be the difference between an important Pokemon being KO'd in 3 attacks instead of 2, this practically never came up. For instance, let's look at a common matchup during the Neo Genesis throughout Skyforge format. The 1 Pokemon Park existed during it. If you were playing Dark Houndoom, whose Darkness Fire attack dealt 30 damage, plus 20 if you discarded Darkness Energy from it, and plus 10 more damage from the Darkness Energy's damage boosting effect, you could threaten a 2-hit KO against Feraligatr, since the Pokemon had 120 HP. While the difference between 120 damage and 110 damage would prevent a 2-hit KO, Feraligatr decks often had better ways of healing. The tool card Goldberry was a common tech option, where the card discards itself from the attached Pokemon if it has 40 more damage on it between turns to restore 40 damage from the attached Pokemon. Not only does Goldberry help Feraligatr avoid being KO'd in 2 attacks, as well as being usable by any active Pokemon, it also plays around other common tool cards and Strength Charm. Strength Charm added 10 damage to the attacks of Pokemon it's attached to at the cost of discard at the end of the turn. Had the Feraligatr player retreated their damaged Pokemon to the bench and used Pokemon Park to restore damage instead of Goldberry, this common damage boosting tool card would still let the Dark Houndoom player 2-hit KO Feraligatr when combined with cards to bring bench Pokemon back into the active spot. Pretty much every deck that wanted their Pokemon to survive 2-hit KOs would use Goldberry over Pokemon Park for superior healing and flexibility. For having too many downsides and simply being outclassed by far better healing options, Pokemon Park deserves a spot on this list. And at number 7, we have Wella Volcano Park, a stadium card with the effect of removing a burned Pokemon's ability to cure itself of the status condition between turns. Usually, when a Pokemon is burned, the owner of the burned Pokemon would put 20 damage counters on between turns and then flip a coin. If the coin came up heads, the burn was cured. Otherwise, the active Pokemon would remain burned. Volcano Park guarantees that the burn would remain until your opponent either retreated their active Pokemon, evolved their active Pokemon, or found another stadium card to play and hoped they could cure the burn between the turns. This card faced 2 massive pitfalls for viability during its standard formats. Firstly, the effect of preventing your opponent from curing burns through a coin flip rarely ever mattered. On your opponent's turn, there were just too many ways for them to cure burn. Perhaps the biggest issue facing the longevity of burn was Guzma seen play in almost all serious competitive decks. Guzma has the effect of switching one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active, and then allowing you to switch your own Pokemon. With a built-in switching effect on one of the most common supporter cards of the format, not only was it very easy to cure a burned active Pokemon by moving it to the bench, but that player also got to use the same card to start attacking vulnerable bench Pokemon. Guzma's very existence made playing decks built around status conditions incredibly difficult, unless they could use the extra damage from status conditions to KO your opponent's active Pokemon in a single hit. In those kinds of decks, Wella Volcano Park had no use, since there would be no burned Pokemon to continuously apply a burn to. The second major issue surrounding Volcano Park was an overall lack of good Pokemon to use the burn status condition with. While you could use Pokemon like Delphox and Fernape to burn your opponent's Pokemon and then deal massively increasing damage with the burn respectively, this combo never saw serious play due to the inconsistencies of needing to play multiple Stage 2 evolution lines, as well as neither Pokemon being particularly strong attackers. Decks built around the burn condition due to their cards being pretty weak, as well as having an extremely difficult time playing into one of the most common staples of the format. For all of this, Wella Volcano Park deserves a spot on this list. And at number 6, we have Sir Chester Bath. This stadium has the simple effect of reducing all damage dealt to basic Pokemon by 20 after applying weakness and resistance. The issue with this stadium card is that it simply just isn't good enough. When the card first released, the standard form of the time was heavily dominated by decks built around basic Pokemon, like Pikachu and Zekrom Tag Team GX and Zacian V. Even with many of the best decks using basic Pokemon, Sir Chester Bath never saw serious competitive play. Not only is it a defensive stadium card that's easy to play around simply by your opponent playing another stadium, even if the stadium remained in play, reducing attack damage by 20 never mattered because 20 damage isn't the difference between a 2-hit KO or a 3-hit KO. For reference, over the course of 2 attacks, most Pokemon in the format would deal around 300 to 400 damage. When no Pokemon in the format had 300 HP, it's pretty easy to see why no deck needed it. The card also never prevented any 1-hit KOs either, so it never had a competitive niche. Sir Chester Bath was just not worth playing. Marking the halfway point at number 5, we have All Night Party, a stadium meant to counter the sleep status condition. When in play, a player whose turn it is can cure a sleeping Pokemon and heal 30 damage from it. When Pokemon is asleep, you flip a coin between turns. If heads, the condition is cured. Otherwise, the Pokemon remains asleep and can't attack or retreat. Sleep can be one of the most frustrating parts about playing the Pokemon TCG, since it stops your active Pokemon from being able to do anything. All Night Party was designed as a counter to sleep-based strategies by giving any deck a guaranteed way to cure the status condition while providing some extra healing. Much like many of the aforementioned cards on this list, there were multiple reasons why All Night Party saw no tournament play during its time in the standard format. Funnily enough, these are the same reasons that the aforementioned Well of Volcano Park never saw play. Firstly, there were better ways to beat status conditions that weren't limited to only sleep. Most decks at the time already played multiple cards that could switch out their active Pokemon, like Escape Rope and Guzma to help move attackers to and from the active spot, meaning it wasn't hard to get rid of the sleep status condition. Secondly, there weren't any good Pokemon looking to abuse how strong putting your opponent's Pokemon to sleep could be. This meant that the very specific niche All Night Party could feel was never needed. Even if there had been a good deck trying to put their opponent's Pokemon to sleep, players would just use more copies of Switch cards to get around it. For being too specific of a counter card that's outclassed by more generic options, it just wasn't worth seeing play. And at number 4 on this list, we have Twist Mountain, a stadium meant to support decks built around restored fossil Pokemon. While in play, the turn player could flip a coin. If the flip came up heads, they could put a restored Pokemon from their hand onto their bench. For context, a restored Pokemon was a special type of Pokemon that could only be put into play by the effect of a corresponding fossil item card. This mechanic was used for the fossil Pokemon during the Black and White and X and Y sets, such as Aerodactyl being put into play by the effect of Old Amber Aerodactyl. Each fossil item has the effect of looking at the bottom 7 cards of the player's deck and letting them put a corresponding restored Pokemon they found there directly onto their bench. The issue with this design is that any restored Pokemon a player drew would be stuck in their hand. Twist Mountain's effect could let you put a restored Pokemon you drew onto your bench like any other Pokemon. While this may have given it a legitimate niche if the effect was guaranteed to work, the fact you only get to put down a restored Pokemon half the time you use Twist Mountain makes trying to build around it generally not worth it. That 50-50 chance of the effect not working or not put a nail in the coffin for decks built around restored Pokemon. Sadly, this is the only reason Twist Mountain never saw play, as there were multiple good restored Pokemon that existed while Twist Mountain wasn't standard. The previously mentioned Aerodactyl's Ancient Stream ability, adding 10 damage to your Pokemon's attacks, was strong at the time due to the lack of damage modifying items or abilities. This was especially true if you could team up multiple Aerodactyls to deal anywhere from 20 to 40 extra damage, a feat near impossible with Twist Mountain's built-in chance of failing. Archeops was an extremely powerful Pokemon Twist Mountain could have made easier to play. This Pokemon has a ludicrous Ancient Power ability that stops both players from evolving their own Pokemon. While this effect doesn't seem too oppressive on paper, as it affects both players, whoever was using Archeops would just build their deck in a way that they never had to evolve outside of the overpowered Stage 1. Having this effect on a Pokemon that only required a single evolution could have been format warping if it weren't for the fact that Archeops evolved from Archon, a restored Pokemon. It's pretty safe to assume the entire reason behind Twist Mountain requiring a coin flip was to make evolving to such strong cards much more difficult, as you wouldn't need to rely on the inconsistency of the false item cards. Ultimately, Twist Mountain was just too unreliable for the deck it was intended to help to boost the consistency of. And at number 3, we have the Indigo Plateau. This stadium has the simple effect of giving all Pokemon Legend in play 30 extra hit points. For those unaware, Pokemon Legend were Pokemon worth 2 prize cards when KO'd that you could only put into play from your hand if you had both halves of their Legend card in your hand. Like many other cards on this list, Indigo Plateau is just a bit too narrow in its application to have seen widespread play. Trying to build decks around the Legend Pokemon was extremely difficult, due to needing 2 cards in hand to even play them, as well as their attacks generally costing a lot of energy. For example, both of Kyogre and Groudon's Legend attacks cost 4 energy, but are extremely powerful if you get to use them. Indigo Plateau was meant to be a tool for these types of decks to keep the attacker the player invested so many cards into alive for longer. While decks built around keeping a single Pokemon Legend alive never reached the top tables at large tournaments, there were many players who tried to take advantage of their strengths. One such strategy was decks built around Kyogre and Groudon Legend, as well as Vileplume and Ranunculus. With the latter 2 Pokemon in play, your opponent couldn't play any item cards, which were called trainers at the time, and you could freely move any damage from Kyogre or Groudon Legend to another one of your Pokemon. In the meantime, you'd use Mega Tidal Wave attack for 4 energy to put the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck into the discard pile and deal 30 damage to each of their Pokemon for every energy card put into the discard. Although this attack dealt damage, it was really used to put all your cards from your opponent's deck into the discard pile, at which point they would lose due to the Pokemon TCG's game mechanics. In this deck specifically, Indigo Plateau fulfilled a solid role in the deck by making Kyogre and Groudon Legend harder to knock out, while setting up both Stage 2 evolutions. When this deck first became playable with the release of Black and White base set, there were very few viable Stadium cards, which meant that one which provided defensive utility like Indigo Plateau could actually be a reliable means of boosting a Pokemon's longevity. While this deck was incredibly powerful if it could actually fully set up, it often ran into issues doing so due to Kyogre and Groudon Legend having an electric type weakness, an enormous issue in a format dominated by powerful electric attackers in Magnezone Prime and Zekrom. While there were decks that could justify using Indigo Plateau, these were just gimmick strategies that saw no competitive play, so it deserves the number 3 spot on this list. And at number 2 on this list, we have Paradise Resort, a World Champion promo card with the effect of reducing the retreat cost of all Psyducks in play by 1 colorless energy. As a special, extremely limited in quantity promo card, Paradise Resort is clearly never intended to be played seriously. As a stadium card, it's entirely outclassed by the incredibly popular Beach Court, as it applies the 1 colorless retreat cost reduction to all basic Pokemon. Hilariously, Paradise Resort could have a theoretical niche over Beach Court in decks that played a lot of Psyducks, because the retreat cost reduction would only affect your Pokemon if your opponent doesn't play any Psyduck. Of course, this niche is pretty much a joke, and Paradise Resort will likely never see competitive play, due to the Pokemon Company trying their hardest to make their World Tournament promo cards bad ever since Tropical Beach accidentally became an impossible to acquire staple while it was legal in the standard format. However, just because Paradise Resort was intended to be terrible, doesn't make it the worst stadium card of all time. Taking the dishonorable title as the worst stadium card of all time, we have Primordial Altar. This stadium has the effect of looking at the top card of your deck and letting you choose to put it into your discard pile. While many other cards on this list have either niche effects or effects that aren't impactful enough to see play, Primordial Altar's effect is almost as close to useless as you can get in the Pokemon TCG. If you decide to play this card, one of 2 things can happen. Either you put the top card of your deck into your discard pile, or you do nothing. In the Pokemon TCG, playing a card just to put the top card of your deck in the discard pile is just not good. If you're playing a deck that wants to put cards in their own discard pile, there are much better options to play than running a stadium as bad as Primordial Altar. To really hammer home how bad this card is, let's take a look at cards like Pokestop. This stadium has the effect of discarding the top 3 cards of your deck and putting any item cards discarded that way into your hand. Not only does Pokestop discard 3 times as many cards, but you can also get more item cards into your hand while doing so. The only upside Primordial Altar has over its much superior counterpart is that it's so bad your opponent won't want to use their own stadium card to get rid of it. Doing so would generally favor whoever put down Primordial Altar, since any stadium your opponent plays might be an upgrade. Supporter cards are powerful trainer cards that can only be used once per turn. However, just like Pokemon, not all supporter cards are up to par with the rest that are released alongside them, by either being weaker or worse versions of supporter cards that already exist, or because their interactions are too hard to pull off to be considered worth playing. And at number 10, we have Here Comes Team Rocket from X and Y Evolutions. When this card is played, both players turn the prize cards face up for the rest of the game. Today, Evolutions is mostly known for being one of the most sought-after collectible booster sets after the hype for it was reignited during the lockdowns in 2020. This is largely due to the nostalgia the set brings with it by reprinting old cards like Pikachu and Charizard from the base set. Another big part of the set was the homage this was paid to older item cards, with some of these item cards being designed without supporter categories in mind as it had been introduced in the first couple of sets. They had to be changed to be supporter cards. One of these cards was Here Comes Team Rocket, which was originally released in Team Rocket as a regular trainer card. The Evolutions version, however, isn't the first supporter version of the card. In 2004, Set EX Rocket Returns, the exact same card had already been released as a supporter card. Back then, this card was already not really relevant, but the Evolutions version rightfully makes into this list due to another card that existed at the same time. Town Map from X and Y Breakthrough is an item card that flips your prize cards face up. Town Map saw a reasonable amount of plays that allowed players to better control their prize cards and can allow them potentially get matchup relevant cards that they could normally only get from the prize cards by luck. He was even featured in the 2018 World Championship winning deck in the Masters division. On the flip side, Here Comes Team Rocket never saw any kind of competitive play. Not only because Town Map was simply a better option by not giving your opponent the same kind of benefit as you got, but also because Town Map didn't require to use your supporter card for the turn just to be able to look at your prize cards. This combination of an already existing card that did a much better job and also not being a supporter card puts Here Comes Team Rocket on this list of the worst supporter cards of all time. And at number 9, we have Swordward and Shieldbird from Sword and Shield Battle Styles. When this card is played, you get to choose a trainer card from your discard pile and show it to your opponent. Your opponent then gets to decide if they want to allow you to put the chosen card into your hand, or if you draw 3 cards. Swordward and Shieldbird is one of the many cards that was released through the Sword and Shield block that featured a draw 3 effect, with additional benefits to make them more interesting and viable than the classic draw 3 supporters that we've gotten ever since Black and White introduced Sharon. Sharon was replaced by Tierno in X and Y, and then again got replaced by Hau in Sun and Moon. Sword and Shield brought not only Ha, but also Friends in Galar, Friends in Hisui, and Berry. We even have confirmation already that Pneumonia from Scarlet and Violet will have the same draw 3 cards effect as many cards before. As previously mentioned, Sword and Shield started releasing some cards with the same effect and additional benefits. Avery draws 3 cards and forces your opponent to discard Pokemon from their bench until they have 3 bench Pokemon. Bird Keeper switches your active Pokemon in addition to a card draw, and Worker has the additional effect of discarding a Stadium card in play. All of these cards have seen some kind of competitive play, with Sword and Shieldbert being the exception. The main reason for it not being viable is that the extra effect is not an additional one, but an alternative, meaning that unlike all the other cards, you don't get to draw 3 cards, but also do something else. The next issue is that your opponent is the one that gets to choose what happens after you pick the trainer card from your discard pile. In most cases, your opponent will simply pick the choice of you drawing 3 cards. The only time they will let you take the trainer card is when they know that you won't get good use for it. In the worst case scenario, you would want to draw 3 cards, but your opponent would allow you to take a trainer card that doesn't help you at all. This combination of a card that already isn't too great on its own, and the fact that there are plenty of other supporters with better effects legal for tournament play at the same time, makes Sword and Shieldbert one of the worst supporter cards of all time. And at number 8, we've got Mom's Kindness from Diamond and Pearl Majestic Dawn. This card simply draws 2 cards. By today's standards, a card that only draws 2 cards would not even be questioned about being viable, considering that many supporter cards draw at least 3 cards, or if they draw 2, have some additional benefits or potential conditions that let them draw even more. This meant that a card that just drew 2 at the time wasn't good enough compared to later in the future when a draw 3 effect became powerful due to the lack of options available. Even in 2008 when Mom's Kindness was released, it was never more than a bulk card that no one looked at. While the modern Pokemon TCG heavily revolves around supporter cards that draw cards in various ways, like discarding cards or shuffling back into the deck, the Diamond and Pearl era in which this card's released was much more search-based, and supporters that just drew cards were rarely printed and didn't see a lot of play. When Majestic Dawn got released, the game still features some cards from the EX block that lasted from EX Ruby and Sapphire in 2003 to EX Power Keepers in 2007. Commonly used supporter cards from these set were Castaway from EX Crystal Guardians, which searches your deck for a supporter, Pokemon tool, or basic energy card. Celio's Network from EX Fire Red and Leaf Green, that searches your deck for any Pokemon except EX, and Steven's Advice from EX Hidden Legends. Steven's Advice is one of the few draw supporter cards that saw a lot of play due to its powerful effect of drawing cards equal to the number of your opponent's Pokemon in play, as long as you don't have 7 or more cards, including this card in your hand when you try playing it. Supporter from the Diamond and Pearl block that saw a lot of play were Roseanne's Research from Secret Wonders, a supporter that searches your deck for 2 cards in any combination of basic Pokemon and basic energies, and Bebe's Research from Mysterious Treasures, which has you put 1 card from your hand on top of your deck, in exchange searches your deck for any Pokemon and puts it into your hand. With those meta-relevant cards, it's already not too hard to understand why Mom's Kindness didn't see any play. But it becomes even more obvious if you look at some of the Diamond and Pearl supporter cards that didn't even see any play but still outclass Mom's Kindness. Team Galactic's Mars from Secret Wonders also draws 2 cards, but in addition also puts a random card from your opponent's hand at the bottom of their deck. Another card we can look at is Professor Oak's Visit, also from Secret Wonders. This card draws 3 cards and then lets you choose a card from your hand and put it at the bottom of your deck. These buff cards that were even released before Mom's Kindness never saw any kind of relevant play, meaning that a nerfed version of them wouldn't see play either. The existence of cards that already have the same effect with additional benefits on top of many good supporters in general make Mom's Kindness one of the most unnecessarily printed cards. And at number 7, we have League Staff from Sword and Shield Vivid Voltage. This card draws 2 cards, and an additional 2 cards if White on Stadium is in play. White on Stadium is a Stadium card that heals 100 damage from a V Pokemon that evolves into a V Max Pokemon. Drawing 4 cards is actually a very good effect, which is why cards that would draw 4 or more cards are usually put behind some kind of barrier. The most prominent or played example of a card like this is Coach Trainer from Sun and Moon Unified Minds. When this card is played, while you have a tag team Pokemon in your active spot, you get to draw 4 cards. Should the condition not be fulfilled, you only draw 2 cards, just like League Staff. Coach Trainer would usually be used in decks that either exclusively ran tag team Pokemon, or only a few copies of cards that weren't, making it a card that drew 4 most of the time. This kind of conditional draw 4 effect started during Sun and Moon with Samson Oak, a supporter that draws 2 cards, and additional 2 of both active Pokemon are of the same type. Especially during Sun and Shield, these kinds of effects have been printed in many types with all kinds of different conditions to be fulfilled. Dan from Rebel Clash only draws the full 4 cards if you beat your opponent in a game of rock, paper, scissors. Schoolboy and Schoolgirl only draw cards if your opponent is on an even or uneven number of prize cards. Or iScan simply replaces the tag team part of Coach Trainer with Hisuian Pokemon in your active spot. One thing all these cards have in common is that they interact with types of cards in play, or don't require any specific cards to be in play. The problem with League Staff is that, in order to draw 4 cards, it requires 1 specific card in play, which means that you can never have more than 4 copies of it in your deck, whereas cards like Hisuian Pokemon or Tag Team Pokemon could be played in larger quantities. Or if you didn't play any cards of other subcategories, would always be guaranteed to be in play. This problem becomes even more apparent when considering that out of the 10 plus cards with conditional draw 4 effects, only Coach Trainer and Schoolgirl ever saw any amount of significant play, as they are the only 2 cards that could be turned into permanent draw 4 cards. As previously mentioned, Coach Trainer could be used in decks that only ran tag team Pokemon, as they weren't forced to run any kind of supporter Pokemon. Schoolgirl would simply be used in decks that only ran Pokemon that give up 2 prize cards, guaranteeing that you would almost always be on an even number of prize cards. This alone makes the league staff borderline unplayable. What makes the card even worse is the fact that the card that was needed to fulfill its condition wasn't used in any kind of deck. Rhydon Stadium never saw any kind of play, so forcing a deck to run 4 copies of a card that wasn't good, just to potentially enable a draw 4 supporter, just wasn't worth it at all. And at number 6, we have Misty's Water Command from Sun and Moon Hidden Fates. This card allows you to move any number of water energies attached to your Pokemon in play to any of your side deck, Horsea, Staryu, Starmie GX, Magikarp, Gyarados, or Lapras. To indicate how bad this card is, we first need to break down how its effect is designed and what it could alternatively look like. The best possible design for a supporter card would simply be one that lets you move any kind of energy of your Pokemon to a different one of your Pokemon. After that, you could restrict which type of energies a card like this could move. This could either specify basic or special energies, but it could also already limit it down to a specific type of basic energy. After that, you would get something like Misty's Water Command, a card that restricts what kind of energy you can move, and also what choice of Pokemon you're even able to move the energies to. Designing utility-based supporter cards can often be hard, as cards that are too generic can often cause unwanted strategies to emerge because they weren't properly thought about when the card was designed. When it comes to moving energies, however, the maximum utility that can be gained from the effect is limited, as you would require an incredibly strong LA acceleration card that could cause unfair interactions. For a card as restrictive as Misty's Water Command, you would expect some of the cards that could make use of it to be playable to actually make it worth playing. This, however, wasn't the case at all. Most of the Pokemon that could make use of it weren't particularly useful, and the only one of them that saw any kind of competitive play was Starmie GX. This Stage 1 GX Pokemon from the same set as Misty's Water Command comes with 3 attacks. Its first attack, Starstream, deals 40 damage for 1 water energy and attaches 2 water energies from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon. Spinning attack requires 3 colorless energy and deals 100 damage. Its GX attack, Hydro Pump GX, deals 40 base damage and an additional 40 damage for each water energy attached to this Pokemon. The deck that made use of Starmie GX featured Mewtwo and Mew GX from Sun and Moon Unified Minds. It said that was released a couple of months after Hidden Fates. With its Perfection ability, which lets you use any attacks to GX and EX Pokemon on your bench or your discard pile, as long as you had the correct energies attached to it. It was primarily used to copy Starmie's Starstream attack to get extra energies into play as quickly as turn 1. Mewtwo and Mew copying the attack from Starmie GX in the discard pile, however, also meant there wasn't even a Starmie GX in play that could have made use of Misty's Water Command, as Perfection didn't require you to play Staryus that you could evolve. The next time the water Pokemon became relevant was when Sword and Shield was released and brought Frosmoth with it. Its Ice Stance ability allows you to attach water energies from your hand to any of your bench water Pokemon as often as you like during your turn. Frosmoth already being able to attach energies to your Pokemon that you want them on meant there was absolutely no need to run a supporter card like Misty's Water Command, especially since none of these decks that made use of Frosmoth's ability even featured Pokemon that could receive energies from Misty's Water Command. The only way to make use of it in these decks would be to force you to play Pokemon you didn't want to, just to use a supporter card with a subpar effect. With none of these water decks ever even being close to consider playing it, it should come as no surprise that Misty's Water Command makes it onto this list of the worst supporters of all time. And at number 5, we have Cedric Juniper from Black and White Legendary Treasures. This card has you put a Pokemon from your hand face down and tell your opponent which Pokemon it is. Your opponent then has to guess the height of that Pokemon, and should they guess correctly, they would draw 3 cards. Otherwise, you got to draw 3 instead. Drawing 3 cards wasn't horrible at the time this card was released, but it came with a couple of issues that caused it to be arguably one of the worst supporters at the time. Firstly, drawing 3 cards was not an amazing payoff if you got your opponent to guess the wrong height. Many decks already played powerful draw cards like Professor Juniper that discarded your hand in order to draw 7 cards, or In, which shuffled both players' hands into their deck to draw cards equal to the remaining prize cards, a card that could be used for both early game consistency or late game disruption due to its versatile nature. Decks that didn't particularly like to discard their hand could even opt to play Bianca, a supporter that draws cards until you have 6 cards in your hand, which would often draw even more cards than Cedric Juniper. The biggest issue for this card, however, and the main reason why it was almost always a mistake to consider for your deck, is Sharon. Sharon simply drew 3 cards and was legal for tournament play during the entire time that Cedric Juniper was. This meant that even decks that wanted to build big hands and wanted a supporter card that drew 3 cards had a much better option than Cedric Juniper, as you never had to have the risk of your opponent getting to draw cards instead. And this gets us exactly to the next issue that this card had. Having to tell your opponent which Pokemon they had to guess the height of could sometimes mean they had an easy time of doing it. An argument that was used as early as this card's reveal was that players could simply memorize the heights of meta-relevant cards in order to always correctly guess the height of these Pokemon. While this could be solved by Cedric Juniper decks using more obscure Pokemon in the strategy, expecting people to actually study heights of Pokemon seemed like a stretch regardless. A much more realistic approach of people being able to correctly guess the height is information that was available to players during a game. If you or your opponent already had a copy of the cards in play, the discard pile, or one that was in your hand, you could simply read off the height and always correctly guess the height. All of these issues combined, in addition to a card already existing that provided the same effect, while already not being meta-relevant itself, makes Cedric Juniper one of the most unnecessary and useless supporter cards ever printed. And at number 4, we have Brock's Training from Sun and Moon Hidden Fates. This card allows you to attach an energy card from your hand to one of your Geodude, Graveler, Golem, Onyx GX, Cubone, Rhyhorn, Rhydon, or Sudowoodo. Much like Misty's Water Command, a card that we've talked about earlier, Brock's Training is too restrictive for the little payoff that it provides. Only a couple of sets after this card's release, the Sword and Shield expansion brought Bede, a supporter that attaches a basic energy card from your hand to one of your bench Pokemon. The only benefits that Brock's Trainer has over Bede are that Bede can't attach to your active Pokemon, and that it only attaches basic energy cards. When considering how useless all the Pokemon featured on Brock's Training are, this is not too much of a disadvantage. What makes this even worse is the fact that Bede never saw any kind of play because attaching an energy card with your supporter for your turn was simply too bad. Much like Misty's Water Command from the same set, Brock's Training combined an already subpar effect with restrictions that forced you to use Pokemon that were completely unviable. Unlike Misty's Water Command, none of the Pokemon featured on Brock's Training ever saw any kind of play, and therefore it makes this card even worse and gets a rightful place on our list. And at number 3, we have Erica from the 2019 set Sun and Moon Cosmic Eclipse. When this card is played, both players get to draw up to 3 cards, with the player playing the card down having to draw first. Erica is in a really weird spot when it comes to its release, because when taking a look at other cards that were released in Cosmic Eclipse, Erica seems out of place. Most other support cards that were released in the same set featured characters from Sun and Moon games. The ones that didn't feature characters that were particularly relevant in those games, or didn't appear in them at all, were cards with entirely new effects, which is where this second part of Erica's weirdness comes in. All the way back in Gym Heroes in 2000, an item card featuring the same character from Red and Blue video games was released. This item, or back then just trainer card, had the same effect of drawing up to 3 cards, followed by your opponent drawing up to 3 as well. Normally, these kinds of pseudo-reprints to pay homage to nostalgic cards are printed in special sets like X and Y Evolutions or Celebrations, or at the very least come in a set that has a similar concept for multiple cards, most often because they were leftover cards from a Japanese mini or promotional set that didn't get in the West, and therefore these cards are put in our regular sets. This doesn't seem to be the case for Erica, as it's the only kind of that card in Cosmic Eclipse, making her feel very out of place already. When it comes to playability, Erica wasn't even too far off the power level of many other cards used during that time. A lot of decks either relied on search-based supporter cards like Guzma and Hala, which let you search your deck for a Stadium card and put it into your hand. Or alternatively, if you discard 2 cards to play the card, it would also allow you to search a Pokemon tool or a special energy card in addition to the Stadium card. Another popular search supporter was Green Exploration, a card that lets you search your deck for 2 trainer cards as long as you don't have any Pokemon with abilities in play. Decks that weren't using these search cards use supporter cards like Welder and Cynthia and Caitlyn. Welder lets you attach up to 2 fire energies from your hand to one of your Pokemon in play and draws 3 cards afterwards. Cynthia and Caitlyn puts a supporter card, other than a different copy of Cynthia and Caitlyn, from your discard pile back into your hand, but can additionally draw 3 cards if you decide to discard a card from your hand when playing it. The card you discarded can also not be picked up from the first part of Cynthia and Caitlyn's effect. So in terms of raw draw power, Erica wasn't even that bad during that time. What makes her horrible, however, is the fact that your opponent gets to draw cards as well. Any card that gives advantage to your opponent in the Pokemon TCG either has to be so incredibly powerful for the player using it that the downsides of helping your opponent doesn't really matter, or it has to immediately end the game so your opponent never gets a chance to use the card they gained access to. And just drawing 3 cards isn't a powerful enough effect to ever fit into these criteria. And at number 2, we've got Riley from Sword and Shield Lost Origin. When you play this card, you reveal the top 5 cards of your deck to your opponent. Then they get to choose 2 of them that you have to discard, and the remaining cards are then put into your hand. Unlike many of the other cards in this list, this might not immediately strike everyone as a horrible effect. But if we take a deeper look at it, it should become relatively clear why this card made it onto this list. Cards that look at the top X cards and require some kind of choice actually have a fantastic track record in the TCG of being viable. Sage's Training from Heart Gold and Soul Silver Undaunted lets you look at the top 5 cards of your deck. You get to pick 2 of them and the rest are discarded. While this card wasn't universally useful at the time, many decks that just needed the extra consistency and often didn't mind discarding some cards, or in some cases even had cards in their deck that they wanted to have in the discard pile, would make great use of it. A more recent example is Colress's Experiment from the same set as Riley, Lost Origin. Just like Sage's Training, it lets you look at the top 5 cards. This time, you get to choose 3 of them to keep, and the remaining cards are put into the lost zone instead of the discard pile. Cards that enter the lost zone can't be used for the rest of the game, but just like decks could turn the discard aspect of Sage's training into a benefit instead of a disadvantage. Many powerful cards are released alongside Colossus' experiment require you to have a certain amount of cards in your lost zone to be used, meaning that this card doesn't just provide consistency, but also enables a lot of cards in your deck. Riley, on the other hand, isn't just a worse version of these cards, it's borderline unplayable. If you only had to reveal the cards to your opponent so they would see your picks, the cards would still be decent. Getting a look at the top 5 cards and picking 3 of them to get into your hand at the cost of your opponent getting some extra knowledge would not be ideal, but could potentially enable some decks that don't mind giving extra knowledge to your opponent. What makes the card awful is that your opponent gets to choose which cards you have to discard. This could potentially mean that you lose key parts of your deck or match up relevant tech cards that you can't afford to get rid of. On top of your opponent getting extra knowledge about the cards you have access to makes it one of the worst supporter cards ever, especially because it can actively cause you to lose. And at number 1, we have Imakuni from X and Y Generations. This card has a very simple effect of just confusing your active Pokemon when it's used. Confuse is a condition where Pokemon has to flip heads to attack or else take 30 damage instead. Before we get into Imakuni, we should take a look at the set that it came in, as X and Y Generations was not a regular expansion to the Pokemon TCG. For the 20th anniversary of Pokemon in 2016, a special set was released that primarily featured Pokemon from the Kanto region and reprinted some of the item cards from the X and Y block. It was not sold in booster box like regular sets, instead Generations was the first Western set that was only sold in promo boxes. Like most of the newer non-booster box sets, Generations also featured some items and supporter cards that were completely new. Some of them, like Revitalizer, an item card that puts 2 grass Pokemon from discard pile into your hand, were playable cards that eventually found their way into decks that could make good use of it. On the other side, we got Imakuni, a card clearly designed to be a joke and not for competitive play. To show how useless this card actually is, we need to take a look at its effect a bit closer. The Pokemon TCG has 5 different status conditions. Poison puts 1 damage counter on the affected Pokemon between turns, Burn puts 2 damage counters on Pokemon between turns, but also has the user of the Pokemon flip a coin to see the status condition gets removed. Sleep and Paralyze make the Pokemon unable to attack, with Sleep flipping a coin between each turn, just like Burn to see the status condition is removed, and Paralyze always getting removed after 1 turn. Lastly, Confusion has the user of the Pokemon flip a coin before attacking. If the flip ends up heads, the attack continues normally, and Tails places 3 damage counters on Pokemon, and the attack isn't used. None of these status conditions are anything that you would want on your Pokemon, but under certain circumstances, putting a status condition onto your Pokemon could actually be beneficial. Abilities that require Pokemon to be affected by a status condition in exchange for more powerful attacks could make use of cards that apply special conditions to your own Pokemon. Another useful way could be an ability that basically copies special conditions onto the opponent's Pokemon. For example, if you use Imakuni on a Pokemon like that, your opponent's Pokemon would now also be confused. Even with these potential scenarios in mind, Imakuni is one of the worst supporters of all time, as putting confusion onto your own Pokemon almost always makes your attacks a 50% chance to miss and deal 30 damage to your own Pokemon. And even the copy abilities would simply be too much effort just to put a special condition onto your opponent's active Pokemon that could easily be removed by something as simple as retreating. However, if we take a look at the backstory of Imakuni's design, it becomes very clear that he was made very bad on purpose. While this Imakuni card is the first we've ever seen of him in the West, Japanese players are very familiar with him, as he was created shortly after the TCG's release over there. From 1997 to 2002, he was part of many promotional live events in Japan, and also received more than 10 cards that featured his character to some degree. One of these cards is Imakuni's Doduo, a card we got shortly after Generations was released in X and Y Evolutions. Imakuni was clearly put into Generations as a joke and purposefully made bad, which made it even easier to put him onto this list, considering that most of the other cards weren't even designed to be bad like this one was. Shiny Pokemon in the video games are super rare Pokemon that only appear once in every couple thousands of attempts, and are usually a different color variation from the original Pokemon to show off its uniqueness. The Pokemon trading card game tried to emulate this in the Neo Revelation set in the year 2000 as secret rare cards, and with the first 2 shiny Pokemon being printed being Shiny Magikarp and Gyarados. And in order to make them even more unique, they came with the rule where you can only have 1 copy of a shiny Pokemon in your deck, and even gave the Pokemon unique attacks compared to their normal counterparts. And you'd think a homage to such a rare, unique catch would have made them much stronger than the average Pokemon, but they kind of never made a splash. The meta they were released into at the time was already dominated by broken Pokemon and weird rulings that made sure they'd never see the light of competitive play in their first iteration. Fast forward 17 years and the Pokemon Trading Card Company has a new mini set called Shiny Legends. This set brought back shiny Pokemon nearly 2 decades after the initial release. This set featured the new and improved iteration of shiny Pokemon, with the remaining shiny Pokemon Shiny Ho-Oh, Shiny Celebi, and Shiny Lugia appearing as promo cards. This time around, Pokemon didn't feature the fan favorites from the second generation, but chose to highlight some of the more popular legendary mythical Pokemon from the series. Also this time around, the ridiculous energy requirements no longer existed when looking at these cards, nor did the 1 per deck rule, allowing players to sport multiple copies and build a strategy around them. With each of these cards having a more niche purpose, rather than being main attackers, this was their time to shine. The most anticipated of the shiny Pokemon was Shiny Jirachi. For a single Psychic Energy, this Pokemon would do 10 damage with its Stellar Rain attack, but the effect of the attack was why this card was expected to make an immediate impact. Stellar Rain would do 10 damage and devolve your opponent's active Pokemon. This effect not only devolved the Stage 2 Pokemon into a Stage 1, but all the way back to its basic form. During this time period, Gardevoir GX was one of the most popular and powerful decks in the standard format. Shiny Jirachi was meant to be paired up with cards like Espeon GX and Garbodor to create a powerful lock strategy that punished your opponent for playing the game recklessly. This didn't exactly go as planned, as many top players brought this card to the European International Championship in London right after its release, and only one player managed to find some success with it. So what went wrong? Players had anticipated this Shiny Jirachi would become somewhat of a threat and understood that a measly 10 damage provided wouldn't be enough, even if they were to devolve an evolution Pokemon all the way down to basic. Players began playing heavier healing cards like Max Potion, and all of a sudden this Shiny Jirachi threat was neutralized. A card that was supposed to fix Gardevoir GX matchup ended up being a big disappointment and didn't see much play after that one event. Another highly anticipated shiny Pokemon was Shiny Mew. Shiny Mew could use its attack Legendary Guidance to search your deck and attach 2 energy cards in any way you like just for 1 Psychic Energy. Players thought this card would enable toolbox style strategies or even ramp up your board in situations where you would fall behind. Shiny Mew also had a second attack for a single Psychic, Beam, which did 10 damage, and that's it. A few players splashed into their Drampa GX/Garbodor decks in an effort to play cards that needed more than 1 energy attachment a turn, like Celestial GX, but this card saw little success, as Shiny Mew simply sat in the binder without making an impact. This was one of the bigger disappointments of the shiny Pokemon, as this card was anticipated to make an impact on release. Shiny Genesect was one of the only shiny Pokemon cards we featured as a main attacker in a deck. Genesect paired with Venusaur had 1 placement at a tournament boasting over 1,000 players, causing players to re-evaluate the card. Venusaur would make Grass Energy on the board count double, and Shiny Genesect's Gaia Blaster read 50 plus 20 for each Grass Energy attached to this Pokemon. Genesect's ability Energy Reload read, once during your turn, before you attack, you may remove a Grass Energy from one of your other Pokemon to this Pokemon. This allowed you to freely move energies around to hit the perfect amount of damage without losing any extra energy unnecessarily. Once the deck became a known quantity, players knew what to expect and which pieces of the combo to chase down when faced with this glass cannon of a deck. This meant that the hype didn't last long, and the lone placement for Shiny Genesect remained, and as quickly as the card entered the limelight, it was forgotten. Shiny Volcanion also had a lone placement paired with Quagsire and Lapras GX. The idea behind adding the Shiny Volcanion was due to its dual pump attack for 3 water energies. The dual pump allowed Shiny Volcanion to do 50 damage to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon, which softened them up for Lapras GX to take them out with its Blizzard Burn attack. Shiny Volcanion's second attack, Quad Smash, says flip 4 coins. This attack does 50 damage for each heads. If you had to use Quad Smash, you were probably in trouble. Using Quagsire's washout ability, which allowed the player to move water energies as often as they like from their bench to their active, and Aqua Patch to accelerate energy onto the board, players were able to use the various attackers in the deck to their advantage. However, the deck itself wasn't considered very good because if it couldn't produce and maintain energies on the board, the deck couldn't do anything. This led to the deck being dismissed as bad, and Shiny Volcanion never saw play again. Shiny Celebi was one of the more interesting shiny Pokemon that came with a unique ability, Time Recall, which read, each of your evolved Pokemon can use any attack from its previous evolutions. However, you still need the necessary energy to use each attack. There weren't any Pokemon at the time that had good enough attacks on their pre-evolutions, that is, in the standard format. In the expanded format, Pokemon cards from the Black and White expansion until the most recent set could be used for play, creating decks and combos that were never meant to interact with one another. There was one of Pokemon's only infinite lock decks, Shock Lock, that used Stoutland and Raichu to stop your opponent from playing the game. Stoutland's ability Sentinel would prevent your opponent from playing supporter cards while it was in the active slot, and Raichu's Evo Shock would then paralyze your opponent's active Pokemon when it evolved its turn, a condition where a Pokemon cannot attack or retreat for 1 turn. After the end of the turn with the paralyzed Pokemon, it returns to normal. Paralysis was one of the rarer stat conditions in the game that needed specific supporter cards like AZ to answer it, so Stoutland became the perfect answer. The Shock Lock player would infinitely loop the opposing player until they ran out of cards in the deck, winning them the game. But how did they manage to keep the loop going? Well, that's where Shiny Celebi comes into play. Lillipup and Stoutland's basic Pokemon pre-evolutions has an attack called Pickup, which allows the player to put an item card from the discard pile into their hand. You would use Pickup to grab the evolution spray, devolve one of your evolved Pokemon, and put the highest stage evolution card on it into your hand to continuously Evo Shock your opponent's active Pokemon. Using cards like Rescue Stretcher and Ultra Ball to recycle your Pokemon into your deck, the player would avoid decking out before their opponent. A very creative strategy and one of Pokemon's only locked decks ever was born from this card. But all good things must come to an end, and Memory Energy was released. Memory Energy had the exact same effect as Shiny Celebi's Time Recall, and it acted as an energy card for Lillipump's attack. Just as quickly as Shiny Celebi found its way into this novel lock deck, it was replaced for something just a bit better. Towards the very end of their life cycle, 2 shiny Pokemon finally got to see some play, but not because they were particularly strong in any way, but because Malamar became one of the strongest energy acceleration energies in the format. Malamar would allow players to attach a basic psychic energy from the discard pile to one of their Pokemon, and because it did not specify once per turn, the Malamar player could accelerate energy equal to the number of Malamar in play on any given turn. This enables the first of the 2 shiny Pokemon we're going to talk about, Shiny Arceus. This Pokemon has the ability called Fabled Defense that prevents all damage done to your bench Pokemon by your opponent's attacks while it's in your active spot. Shiny Arceus' attack, Ultimate Arrow, would do 30 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon for any 4 energy. While this attack cost was particularly steep, it nestled itself well into spread strategies that were becoming popular at the time. Paired with cards like Tapu Koko and Giratina, this Malamar deck could power up any of these attackers at a moment's notice to overwhelm boards with spread damage. There was a unique tool card called Spell Tag that allowed players to place 4 damage counters on their opponent's board in any way they liked if a psychic Pokemon was knocked out. This let us put perfect numbers on the board for potential KOs with spread numbers. Giratina was also a hard-hitting Pokemon that swung for 130 damage with its Distortion Door ability and could always bring itself back from the discard pile. This made the deck extremely low maintenance and had an extremely strong late game finisher in the form of Tapu Lele's Magical Swap, which for a psychic and colorless allowed you to move around damage counters on your opponent's board as you see fit. This would set up for some 6-prize turns all at once, snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. Spread decks, however, had one small problem: their damage output. If an opposing player played smartly and didn't bench too many Pokemon or played healing cards, it became difficult to get damage to stick on the board. Oftentimes, because of low damage output, the spread deck would lose by a turn or 2, even if everything was going their way. This made Spread and Shiny Arceus a gimmick strategy at best, and besides a handful of placements, it didn't see too much competitive play. The most vanilla of the shiny Pokemon, Shiny Lugia, saw the most success. Shiny Lugia came with 2 attacks, the first being Argent Wing, which for 3 colorless energy swung for 60 and an additional 60 of your opponent's active Pokemon had an ability. The second attack, requiring 4 colorless energy and swung for 130 damage, with the downside being that Shiny Lugia had to discard energy for the attack. One of the biggest reasons that Lugia began seeing play was the rise in decks that centered around the Shrine of Punishment. This stadium placed a single damage counter in between turns on Pokemon GX and Pokemon EX on both sides of the field. There were a few decks that would only place single prize attackers like Buzzwole, making it difficult for some of these powerhouse big beater decks to prize trade efficiently. That's where Shiny Lugia came into play, being able to trade 1-for-1 against a lot of these single prize decks, and having fighting resistance meant that a handful of these single prize matchups went from an auto loss to even. Shiny Lugia made its first appearance in Malamar decks as another vanilla attacker, but quickly got replaced by other options. Where it made its big splash was in Rayquaza GX/Vikavolt. Vikavolt allowed the player to search their deck for a Grass and Lightning energy and attach it to their Pokemon in any way they liked. Oftentimes, the deck would set up multiple Vikavolts, leading to very easy ways to chain attackers. The main attacker of the deck, Rayquaza GX, was a 2-prize attacker that only had 180 HP, which meant that a lot of these decks that have single prizers that can swing for 130, coupled with a few Shrine of Punishment ticks in between turns, could spell disaster. Players began bringing multiple copies of Shiny Lugia in an effort to offset the prize trade, and the games became a lot more even. Shiny Lugia then remained pretty under the radar until the release of Welder and Reshiram and Charizard GX. Welder allowed the player to attach 2 fire energy from their hand to any Pokemon they like and draw 3 cards after. And Reshiram and Charizard GX had an incredibly powerful attack in Flare Strike for 3 fire and colorless energy that did 230, with the lone drawback being that this Pokemon could not attack the following turn. Shiny Lugia made its way into early iterations of this deck as a card that could do a lot of damage early to big threats, as well as one-shot cards with abilities like Jirachi without placing your main attacker in a poor position. The card did not last long in lists as players found better alternatives, but for a short moment, we saw Shiny Lugia come back into the metagame, even if only for a few weeks. Who knew that having fighting resistance and colorless attacks that hit for a perfect 130 damage would make this unlikely card into a staple for a few months in Vikavolt? Shiny Pokemon were never the star they were intended to be, and outside of the initial shock and awe and release in the year 2000, they never garnered any discussion. Forever destined to be side actors in the story, they came quietly, made a small ripple, and left without even saying goodbye. With no more ways of support for this mechanic, it seems likely that this archetype created for collectors and fans of the game will remain completely irrelevant outside of nostalgia players who want to find underexplored decks for their old format gameplay. It's hard to say what kind of support would be needed for these cards to be more prominent, but it's painfully clear that what they had just wasn't enough.